Hi, everyone. We'll just give it a couple more minutes. Looks like we're about half of our advisory committees here. I'm expecting most folks to be able to join us.
Adam, it's Sarah. I had trouble hearing before. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, yes.
Okay, great. Okay, now I can hear you. We're set.
Great. Hi, Travis.
Hello.
You're the only two camera feeds I see, so that's why I thought I'd say hi. I see a lot of gray boxes otherwise. Hi, Nicole. All right, let's give it about one more minute to let some others log in, and then we'll go ahead and get started here. All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. We've got still a few others I expect to still show up from the advisory committee, but thanks to everyone who's already been able to join us. So good afternoon. My name is Adam Schultz. I'm the lead electricity and markets policy group here at the Oregon Department of Energy. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for the first Oregon RTO Advisory Committee meeting. We have a pretty full agenda, so I want to get right into it. But first, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ruchi Sudhir, for a few words.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. My name is Ruchi Sudhir. I'm Associate Director for Strategic Engagement. I'm working with Adam and the team here in this process. And just a few reminders about our work and how this meeting is going to run. The first is that we have RTO Advisory Committee members and ODO staff as panelists. So that's why you can see faces and kind of unmute yourself. But we have a lot of other people who are really interested in this topic, and we welcome their participation. In order to sort of run the meeting in a way that's effective for our virtual space, we're going to have an ability for members of the public to get on camera and also speak. We're just reserving that at the end after you kind of hear the discussion. We also welcome written comment at any time, but that sort of is the way that we're facilitating the meeting to try to run it well. We also, a bunch of us actually went to a diversity, equity, and inclusion conference last week, and there were community agreements that were used, and we were thinking about kind of carrying that forward. So this is the first time we're kind of reflecting those here, but really, we really liked that conference in that it was designed to foster an inclusive and respectful workshop and meeting. And so we want to do the same thing here. It's really in line with the next slide you're going to see about our agency and our strategic plan. So just a few reminders that, we're all here. We're spending a lot of time together this afternoon. Just be present, be ready to learn from each other, and be respectful. We know that sometimes learning happens outside of our comfort zone. So just acknowledge that, know that that can sometimes be how you feel. We've all been practicing like how to listen well and how to think about how our responses reflect what we're feeling and what we're thinking about. And just know that we're all working on this sort of remote world for some time now with COVID, but we're still sometimes working on that. So just thank you for being flexible and patient around any technology issues that may arise. And if you are having a technology issue, just let us know, ask for it. Linda Ross is supporting this meeting, and you can let her know in the chat, and a bunch of us from ODO will try to help so that you can be engaged. Next slide, please. So I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't remind you what our mission is. The agency went through a strategic planning process over the past 3 years, and we revised our mission. So this is our new mission. It's a little longer than it used to be. It reflects our work a little bit more. The Oregon Department of Energy helps Oregonians make informed decisions and maintain a resilient and affordable energy system. We advance solutions to shape an equitable clean energy transition, protect the environment and public health, and responsibly balance energy needs and impacts for current and future generations. So what does that mean in terms of what we do? Well, we, on behalf of Oregonians, achieve our mission by providing a central repository for energy data, information, and analysis, a venue for problem-solving Oregon's energy challenges, energy education and technical assistance, regulation and oversight, and we run some energy programs and activities directed by the legislature. So you see a lot of those things happening in this process and in this meeting. So we're really glad that the legislature called upon us to help convene this conversation. So with that, I'll turn it back to my colleague, Adam.
Great, thank you, Ruchi. So here's our look at the agenda this afternoon, which I did send around on Friday. Hopefully folks had a chance to take a look at that. We have a lot of material to go through. I know, thank you all for the time and effort you put into your responses to our questions. We recognize that was not a small ask. So a few welcome remarks, restate our objective, timeline, some logistical issues. Then I wanted to really spend a lot of time on introductions and have a roundtable discussion. We have a few prompting questions to guide that, but we find that in a lot of meetings of this size, we tend to have a good discussion during the roundtable, so we want to give space for that. And then a little bit of a review of the scope of the literature review that we're asked to do as part of this process by the legislature, and then get into the written feedback that you all submitted to us last week. And that's really how the agenda is structured. You know, some of these issues will probably warrant more discussion than others, so we may kind of go faster and slower as warranted. But that's sort of how we have things structured this afternoon, with a break built in the middle. So thanks for your time and for bearing with us this afternoon. So first, just a few welcome remarks, and I did because there is going to be a lot of talking on my part and a lot of words on the screen. I wanted to throw in glamour shots of our state as we go along the way. So here's the first of many with John Day Dam. So first, again, thank you. Sincerely, thank you for all the effort and work you've already put into this. I could see that in just the thoughtfulness and thoroughness of the responses we got. And a quick recap, really, of what SB 589 asks us to do, us being a department and the advisory committee that we've convened. It's asked us to review recent studies and reports relevant to RTO formation in Oregon. It's asked us, of course, to form and host this advisory committee, to develop scoping questions based on some of the findings from those studies and reports, to seek feedback and input from the advisory committee, and then lastly, to report that back to the legislature by the end of the year. So we've kind of shaped this objective statement that we think encapsulates what we're really trying to accomplish here, and that's to gather and synthesize the range of perspectives on the benefits, costs, opportunities, challenges, and risks of RTO formation that exist among a diverse range of Oregon stakeholders to inform the state legislature and other interested parties. So you'll see that objective statement a couple other times today. I just wanted to state that clearly up front. That's how we see the objective of this effort. On the logistics side, we've already kind of reviewed the agenda, so don't need to go over that again. Just to know, we are recording this meeting, and we'll plan to put this, post this online afterwards if anyone is interested. The next advisory committee meeting, next and final, we only anticipate there being two, is scheduled for the morning of Wednesday, October 6th. So for our advisory committee members, that should already be on your calendars. If not, let me know. And for anyone else who's interested in attending from the public, please make sure you've registered separately for that. Then a little further down the road, we'll provide a minimum 2 weeks of time for the committee to review our draft report. We apologize, it's going to be somewhat of a tight timeline, but we'll show you on the next slide sort of the overall timeline of where we are. And then again, just a note on public comments, we do have, if I should have pointed out on the agenda, reserved time at the end of the afternoon today for public comment from anyone who is not on the advisory committee. So we certainly are looking for your feedback and input, but the primary focus today is on our advisory committee. So as I mentioned, here's just a quick overview of the timeline. Where we are. We had a kickoff meeting with this group back in August. I distributed the scoping questions also in August and got everyone's responses last week. Here we are at our first meeting. Second meeting scheduled in a couple weeks. I do have a third date reserved, which I believe I shared earlier with the advisory committee. I don't anticipate us needing that, but I will look to you all at our next meeting if there's interest or if folks think we should have a third meeting. And then we'll be distributing the draft report. At some point in November, I have a date on here that is my drop dead at the very latest date. Hopefully we get it out to you sooner than that, but a minimum of 2 weeks before we have to turn that back around and get it processed, published for the legislature on December 31st. So with that, I will shift this over to introductions and roundtable discussion. The way I was hoping we could do this is have advisory committee members just introduce themselves and their organization first. Keep that short and simple. And then after we get through the advisory committee, I have a couple of sort of prompting questions that I'll put up on the screen, and then we can get into a bit of a roundtable discussion. So I was thinking we just do a quick 10-minute introductions first, if that works for everyone. So I suppose there's probably no better way to do it than just the way they're listed here on the screen. So I see Representative Marsh here. I do not see Senator Taylor. So we can start with Representative Marsh.
Sure. This is Pam Marsh. I am House Representative for District 5, which is Southern Jackson County, and a member of the advisory committee. We are in the legislature. For some of you who might not be paying attention to all the details, is in special session today. So we're sort of camped out wherever we can find a place within the Capitol because there's construction at all the places we would normally be. So it's a little chaotic here, and I imagine Senator Taylor is deeply engaged over on the Senate side and some the essential redistricting work. So we may not see her today, but I am very happy to be here with all of you.
Thank you for joining us. So I can call on folks, or if you want to go down the list, however we want to do it here. But Commissioner Toney, how about?
Good afternoon, everyone. Commissioner Toney with the Oregon Public Utility Commission. Very much looking forward to listening and learning this afternoon. Thanks so much, Adam.
Right. And do we have, I don't see Kristen from the governor's office. I suspect she may also be tied up with legislative issues. And I know Scott Coe sent me a note. He'll be joining us a little bit later today from Emerald PUD. I saw Nicole.
Hi, Adam. Thanks. Nicole Hughes, Executive Director of Renewable Northwest. We are a renewable energy advocacy organization that represents renewable energy generators, developers, and other organizations that support the work they do, as well as nonprofits that are interested in the decarbonization benefits of renewable generation on the electricity grid. Our geographic footprint is Oregon, Washington, Montana, and Idaho, and I'm very pleased to be here today. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Frank?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Frank Lawson, the CEO and General Manager of Eugene Water and Electric Board. We serve approximately 200,000 people in the Eugene area, along with parts of the McKenzie Valley. I'm excited to be here this afternoon, excited about the opportunities to learn. We definitely, there's a lot of talk about RTOs and organized markets across the region. We're participating in many of those and are excited about the opportunities that it can create. So I would say that we're generally favorable of the idea. We also know that the details matter, and it's an opportunity to look at this like we do a lot of other things, so a challenge and an opportunity. So look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Frank. And sorry, did I skip Robert? I may have gone in strange order there. Robert, I saw your name pop up.
Yes, Adam, thank you. Hi, I'm Robert Eckenrode, General Manager and CEO of Umatilla Electric Cooperative out in Umatilla and Morrow County. We're an electric cooperative. We have an area with rather significant load growth, which makes us interested in an RTO, and we're also in a good geographical part of the state to facilitate the renewable energy growth that the state is seeking. So again, we're very interested on both sides of the RTO equation. We anticipate a net benefit, and we look forward to participating in this committee. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Sarah.
Hi, Sarah Edmonds with Portland General Electric. We serve approximately 900,000 Oregonians. Happy to be here, work on various regional matters having to do with resource adequacy and market expansion. So really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Great, thank you. I did not see Oriana. Checking my list of gray boxes in front of my screen here, but I do not see Oriana. Travis.
Hi, thank you. Travis here. I'm the business manager at IBEW Local 125. We serve a lot of the utilities in the northern part of Oregon, but we do have Bonneville Power Administration that we represent the employees at, and that footprint covers Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. So we cover not only the utility side of the business, we also cover the contracting side for utility type work. And so interested in the discussion and to make sure that we move forward in a system which doesn't harm the current system that we have in place.
Great, thank you, Travis. Lindsay. Looks like you're on mute.
Oh.
There we go.
Sorry about that. Lindsay Schleckaway with Pacific Corp. We serve customers in 6 states, in Oregon, Washington, California, Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. And again, thank you for having me. And we're also very interested in this discussion today. Thank you.
Great, and Spencer?
Hey, Adam, thanks for having me. Spencer Gray with the Northwest Intermountain Power Producers Coalition. NIPSI is the trade association of independent power producers and wholesale and retail marketers in the 4 Northwestern states. Really pleased to be here.
Thank you, Spencer. Ravi.
Yes, good afternoon, Adam. Thank you. Ravi Agarwal from Bonneville Power Administration. Not sure Bonneville needs an introduction here, but we are a federal power marketing administration and market power from both Federal Columbia River Power System, and we own and operate roughly 15,000 circuit miles of high voltage transmission system in the Pacific Northwest. And thank you for having me on this as an ex officio member. Thank you.
Great, thanks for joining us. Let's go to Fred.
Good afternoon, everybody. Fred Hewitt with the Northwest Energy Coalition. I'm in Portland. Our organization is active in the 4 Northwest states. We also have members in British Columbia. We have about 100 organizational members, lots of different kinds, including some utility members, Portland General Electric being one. And I'd say our view is that we favor market development, but markets done right. Of course, there's a lot of different issues and perspectives underneath that cliche. Also have to say, I'm going to have to drop. I'm going to be inactive here on the call for about a half an hour. I have another call I have to take, but I'll be back. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Fred. Let's go to Kathy.
Hi, I am Kathy Anderson, a senior manager at Idaho Power over real-time operations and markets. Idaho Power, we have more than 590,000 customers in both Idaho and Oregon, and so therefore we're really interested with this conversation, and thank you for inviting us to participate.
Of course. Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Quila with the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. We're an interstate compact between the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana. And just here as somebody providing technical expertise, as somebody who's been part of these conversations for a long time, the council has no official view, of course, on markets.
Great, thank you, Ben. Mike.
Thanks, Adam. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Getz. I'm the General Counsel of the Oregon Citizens Utility Board. If you're not familiar with us, we're an independent nonprofit. We represent the interests of the residential customers of Oregon's investor-owned utilities, and grateful to be taking part in this process and looking forward to ensuring that some of the benefits that an RTO promises accrue to customers. Thanks.
Great, and wrapping us up is Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary Pleasant from Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and I'm here from the Office of Greenhouse Gas Programs. Specifically, I'm the subject matter expert and for accounting for greenhouse gas emissions in our electricity sector, and here more just on technical expertise as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you everyone, and thanks for joining us. I will move on to the roundtable discussion next, but just a quick note before we do that, we have about 30 folks who are attendees, not members of the advisory committee. If you're able to put your name and organization in the chat for all of us to be able to see, that would be great. And then again, we will have time at the end of the agenda today for public comment where we can have audio and video on for you. So I just wanted to get the conversation going today with a couple of prompting questions here. So, again, kind of the objective statement that we reviewed earlier is really about us trying to identify the range of perspectives that are out there. So we recognize that we put a lot of questions on the table, got a lot of feedback. They may or may not have captured the range and universe of issues and questions that folks have. So we thought we would just have a roundtable discussion and really just give an open forum for folks to put things on the table. So some guiding questions, if you have is there a primary issue? If you had to identify one that you really want to be sure that we surface for the legislature in our report. And two, almost maybe more importantly, what's missing? Again, we asked a lot of questions, but we didn't ask everything. So I'll throw those two questions out, and I'm happy to just cold call people, but I know that folks here have a lot of thoughts and perspectives and opinions on this. So I am happy to just open up the floor, and any thoughts or feedback?
Adam, it's Sarah. You may have noticed that Portland General and Pacificor submitted comments together. We coordinated, submitted comments labeled as joint utilities. One of the themes you'll see in our comments, maybe ad nauseum, is whether or not we see a net benefit is largely going to depend on the specific market design that's related to that regional transmission organization. There is not necessarily one market design package coming from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission delivering RTO design. There's quite a bit of variation, and I think some of the work we'll be doing in this committee is to explore some of those issues. But which way the pendulum swings in terms of benefits will largely depend on that design. It makes this effort especially challenging, but as Frank said, there's a lot of opportunities buried there as well. And I think things that are complex that couldn't possibly be handled thoroughly in the scoping questions, one thing that I would put on that radar is the complexity around how to allocate transmission costs, not just for new assets that we might identify as being beneficial to the footprint, but what do we do with the cost of the existing transmission voltage lines? How do we spread those costs among RTO participants in a way that is balanced, that represents benefits, but also lets the RTO move forward? Thank you.
Great, I appreciate that. And certainly that feedback, you'll see it when we get into the responding to the written feedback. That was certainly one of the major things we want to flag. Yes, is that certainly it's challenging to answer some of these questions in sort of the hypothetical without a concrete proposal. So certainly understand and appreciate that feedback.
So Adam,
this is oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Adam, this is Ravi from Bonneville. I don't know what your expectation from an ex officio members are, but if I had to make a comment, I would probably second the comment that Sarah made. I think Bonneville being a PMA, so I wouldn't speak as an ex officio, but as a Bonneville member, that you have a unique actor in Bonneville's presence in the region as one of the federal PMA. So cost allocation and how it's allocated of existing transmission would also be a very important point to be considered, or a principle to be considered in the formation or discussion of the RTO. Thank you. But at the same time, Adam, it would be good for you to clarify what role you're looking from the ex officio member. I don't want to be intervening way too much, so please do let us know.
Oh no, you're totally fine. We want to hear from all of you on this advisory committee. So thanks for that feedback, Frank.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. So Sarah's comments about the handling of existing investments sort of really kind of dovetails with some of my thoughts about the importance of facilitating investments that are good for the region. You know, one of the things that, you know, a bilateral sort of independent market and transmission system gets to is that you have to find investments that are good for your utility, and so it's unique to your utility to really leverage the benefits of a region, which is really, it's especially going to be needed given the fact that we have multiple states with different kind of carbon legislation or renewable legislation, to look at this for the benefit of the region and try to find ways to facilitate investments, both in transmission as well as in resources, given some of those sort of legislative changes, I think is really an important aspect that needs to come out in this plan. Otherwise, if you look at it individually as utilities, you won't get that same degree of investment. And at some point, that's going to box us into a corner. And so I would want to emphasize how an organized market across the region can really not only allocate the existing investments, but really facilitate the investments that we probably know need to take place. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Adam, this is Nicole. I didn't know if you wanted us to be raising our hands in the thing or just to hop in, but
No, let's just we can do a hop in for now.
Okay.
If it gets too out of hand, we can use the hand raising.
Okay, thanks. So I want to say that I really appreciate the comments I've heard so far. You know, as I looked at this question, the question is one primary issue that you'd like for this committee to surface. I think about what the purpose of this study is, and it's to inform the legislature. And I think, what is it that we want them to know? And one of the things that was concerning a little bit to me when I was trying to answer the questions is that we are getting into the weeds a little bit on the technical when we don't have a concrete proposal to look at. So I really appreciate Sarah's comments on that. That being said, I also don't want this to be presented as if these are all of the challenges and all the problems, because there are some technical challenges that are going to have to be overcome, but they're not insurmountable. And that's the purpose of coming together and getting them out on the table and just having conversations about them. So I think, you know, let's try and keep in mind what it is that we want the legislature to learn about this process and what some of the things are that we need to address when we're answering these questions going forward. And I just want to say also that I really, really do appreciate everybody's detailed responses. I've already learned a lot, and I'm very excited to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely. I can't thank you all enough for that. Don't be shy. I'm sure others have comments.
Hey, Adam, I'll jump in. This is Spencer. I guess building on Nicole's comments there, I think it would be, for your first question here, what primary issue to identify for the legislature to surface in the report, coming up with a broad value proposition that's informed at some level with the details that we can help flesh out, and you and your staff can as well, seems really valuable to me. And I think about that in the context of, why have other parts of the country formed RTOs at different parts in time in the past 30 years? And what was the purpose of attempting to form an RTO in the West multiple times in that same 30-year time span, and kind of what's different today. And as I think about it, the commitment of the state of Oregon, state of Washington, and other states in the West to decarbonize not just the power sector, but deeply decarbonize the whole economy, which means other sectors increasingly electrifying. That seems to me to be a primary difference today compared to the iterations of RTO discussions nationally and in the region. And so to the extent a report could look forward to that commitment in the region and what the grid looks like in 5 or 10 years, if we go down the current path of our current system versus one that's drawing on geographic diversity to bring more low carbon resources online, that would be a really useful point to illustrate to me in the value proposition in 2021 of forming an RTO.
Thank you, Spencer, for those comments.
This is Travis Erie,
Yes.
IDEW. Some of the things that, because I need to learn a lot more about where this has been in the past, the past efforts to form an RTO and what's been the obstacles with our utilities. Things that came to mind when I was going through the questions were the process of potentially trying to reduce rates overall for consumers seems difficult when we're trying to maintain transmission assets. We wouldn't want to create any scenario where transmission assets are not getting the investment that they're needed. Right now, I think we have a lot on our plate to try to make sure that we're taking care of what we already have in place, and trying to create an organization that can, I think, tackle, reducing those overall transmission rates is going to be difficult, and creating a new entity in itself while continuing to invest in our current system.
Thank you, Travis. Any other responses or thoughts on these prompting questions? Commissioner Tani?
Commissioner Tani, go ahead. I can go next.
Thanks, Mike. You can call me Lisa, please, in this forum.
Sounds good.
Yeah, please. I reflect on how much time the commission has spent on some of these questions about regionalization over the last 20 odd years. And, our focus has always been, and I think will continue to be, what that value proposition is and how it delivers value to Oregon customers or reduces risks for them. And that I think there's some ways to think about that, even though we don't have a deep design in front of us. So I appreciate the conversation about identifying that value proposition in broad terms. I mean, this is why we pointed to the value of an RTO or more wholesale markets in our SB 978 report in terms of improving competition and reducing costs potentially. I think the countervailing challenge to bring forward for the legislature is that an RTO is, of course, not a panacea. It doesn't solve everything. And in some ways, it relocates some of the challenging conversations we have in the region into a new forum, but it doesn't necessarily resolve those arguments. And, where we have really struggled in the past around cost allocation or giving up local control, I think remains a challenge, and that's where governance and really sound, transparent, future-proof governance becomes really critical to any solution that comes to the table, and really ensuring that it will provide value for Oregonians over the long term. And that's an issue that just has to come forward, I think, front and center as we engage. But I really look forward to learning a great deal from other folks like Nicole, enjoying the comments and learning a lot. So always more to unpack on this topic.
Great, thank you, Letha. And just one comment I want to mention, and I have this on a later slide when we get into the written feedback. You know, I don't really see this process as us trying to reconcile differing perspectives or, you know, hammer out negotiated settlements and make recommendations or anything like that. We really are trying to faithfully understand and be able to reproduce for the legislature what those perspectives are out there on some of these key issues. Sort of end of statement, right? So we're not looking at this process as trying to reconcile and you know, blaze new ground on new solutions. So just want to make that comment. Mike, you were.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Yeah, I'll just echo a lot of the comments that I've heard already as far as the primary issue in CUB's position to be to, you know, optimize, you know, the system and be able to accrue kind of benefits to customers to the greatest extent that we can. And I think, you know, the program design and the details that we eventually get into are what's going to, you know, determine the level of benefits that accrue to customers. And so I think maybe starting with broad value propositions has been, you know, suggested and getting maybe kind of narrowed into, you know, more, you know, identifiable kind of pieces of the program design that can lead to those benefits is a good approach to take. And then in terms of what's missing, I think these two are kind of linked in my opinion, but to be able to inform a program design that kind of suits our region the best, I think we need to take a look at, you know, what kind of processes that are out there already or are being implemented or will kind of come into the future can help inform this process. And I'm thinking in terms of the Northwest Power Pool's RAP process and potential expansion, future expansion into, you know, the EDAM market. I know that there's folks out there that kind of see, you know, a resource adequacy program and an extended day ahead market as kind of stepping stones towards potentially getting into a more regionalized approach that, you know, leverages geographic and resource diversity. And so maybe taking a step back and looking at what those programs can offer and if there's any you know, information that we can glean from either their implementation or their program design that can set our region up best to, you know, form an RTO that really gets the most bang for its buck.
Thank you, Mike. Anyone else there? I'm happy to move us along a little sooner. I was also going to throw out, I saw Ben your camera came on. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I thought
I was trying to jump in there, Adam. Thanks. I was just going to say, we've done a lot of work recently looking forward at the sort of policies coming down the road at a lot of the Western states. And one of the things that I think is really important to consider in this is if there's a lot of transformative sort of policies out there, they're really going to change the way the system works and change the way the markets work. You know, what's the best way to be positioned for the state of Oregon to make sure that we are basically helping to mitigate any risks that might raise. And so in particular, of course, California has a bunch of policies about the way that they're transforming their energy sector, and it's going to have a lot of impacts on Oregon and the rest of the Northwest. But I think one of the things you always have to keep in mind in any report looking at something like this is, you know, is this a incremental change to the current state, or, you know, would the current state be better going forward? What are the things that are going to come up as you're looking into the future, given the way that we operate today? And is that going to cause some problems we might not see today in the current operations of the system that might be dealt with if you went to something like an RTO in a very different way? And so I guess that sort of prospective look into the future is just one of the things I'd want to make sure you emphasize and highlight.
Thank you, Ben. Anyone else?
Adam, there was one thing I was going to add based on the first question that you posed.
Sure.
And that's, you know, this is going to the legislature, and I think that it maybe a direct way for me to state this would be that when it comes to regional policy, local legislators will matter. Decisions, you know, across the region are going to have to work with local people, whether that's at a state level, whether it's a PUC, whether it's a legislature. the system is physically interconnected. And so Oregon in this case is going to have to find a way to participate. It's probably not a matter of if, but when. And so I think really one of the messages for me is pretty clear that Oregon is going to have to participate at some point. And so how and when, and we can inform the legislature as to the issues, whether that be governance or resource adequacy or whatever. I think that's going to be important. That's the realization for the legislature, is that they are going to have to make policy decisions that can facilitate an RTO.
Thank you, Frank.
This is Kathy, and I think adding on to Frank, I agree with that. I think it's also, I think our, not just Oregon legislatures, but just thinking like in Idaho as well as other states, there has to be some kind of consistency among that as well, especially for those entities that work in multiple jurisdictions. We can't have rules in Oregon that fight rules in Idaho, and Pat can't have rules in one state that fight the other 5. So some kind of collaboration as we move towards a regionalization with the legislatures, I think would be really beneficial and helpful to make this move forward and to make it just smoother for that, because the footprint matters when you're talking an RTO. One single state, unless you're maybe the size of California, is not quite as beneficial as this large state multi-state footprint. And so that's really also an important thing to remember, is the collaboration that needs to happen across state borders.
Thank you, Kathy.
And Adam, I'll just add to what Kathy just said. That's a really important piece that she brought up. I think, one of the recommendations we've been making is that states need to have specific individuals that are assigned to be speaking with other states, energy offices, other states, energy environment committees need to be talking. I know the commissioners have forums where they're already speaking about things on a regional basis, but it's really important in, even in things like implementing clean energy standards, that we're looking not just at the borders of our states, but sort of how are we going to meet the needs of our region in terms of reliability and decarbonization and all those important things, when we know that we don't rely on our own state just for resources. We know that we share resources across borders. So having that sense of, at this time, we're now talking about something that affects more than just the state of Oregon is a really good perspective.
Yep, thank you, Nicole. Definitely heard that in some of the written feedback as well, for sure. Any other comments or feedback during this roundtable open forum, or should I move on with the agenda and we can be a little ahead of schedule? I'm happy to do that. Okay, I think I'll move us along for now. There'll be plenty of opportunity on a lot of these topics. There's a lot of interrelatedness, certainly, so a lot of these issues will come up again throughout the afternoon. So next, I wanted to just very briefly review the scope of the literature review that we were asked to do by the legislature. So I didn't know how to do this other than a very dry showing you here what the statute actually says, right? Because I think there was some questions maybe about the draft that we sent around to everyone on the advisory committee. So the legislation asks us to review studies and reports relevant to development or expansion of an RTO, right? To prepare a summary of those reviews, and then consider any additional studies or reports that come out after July of this summer. And then, of course, include all that in our report back to the legislature this fall. So I just wanted to kind of share our interpretation of what that means, and so kind of the charge we took from that as a department, right? So we really thought that we were charged with looking out at the technical studies that are out there. Certainly, many people on this meeting have been involved with many of those studies, whether it's the state-led study that came out most recently, or any number of others that we looked at and that we know are out there. But some important caveats. We really, the literature review that we put out there as a draft and that we intend to include in the final report to the legislature it's really intended to reflect the findings of those reports and studies, right? It's not intended to be conveying any sort of endorsement by us, by the department, by the state, or this advisory committee. So it's kind of to make that really clear that that's our intention, right? We're trying to accurately represent the findings of the literature that's out there. And then, like I said, as my last bullet point here says, fully expect that members of this committee may challenge or disagree with some of those findings, and certainly we saw some of that in the written feedback, and I expect we hear more of it today and in our next meeting. So just wanted to add some background and sort of level setting for how we're thinking about the literature review, just to be sure that we're transparent about how we view that effort. That said, we do recognize that there are a lot of studies and reports out there, and we certainly were not completely exhaustive, right? We tried to pick the ones that we knew about already that tend to get pretty good circulation or were more current. But admittedly, there are others that we didn't cover. So I just want to give an opportunity. If there are other studies or reports, something else out there that you really feel like is something critical for us to include, you don't have to let me know now. If you know now, that's perfectly fine. You can throw it out there, but just let me know via email before our next meeting. I'd appreciate that. And in doing so, really try to identify for us why you think it adds something separate. We really tried to boil that effort down and really try to keep it very high level of sort of the quantitative findings of some of those studies, since directionally they tend to be in some alignment. So I will just pause there on that and see if anyone has any questions or feedback on the literature review before I move on. And seeing none, I'm not that familiar with this platform, but if there is a hand raising function, maybe someone from Odo can help me out here. If there is, that might be an easier way for me to see if someone has something to say. Otherwise, I'm just kind of waiting to see if a blue line lights up around your box if you have something to say. So, oh, and I see Oriana has joined us. If maybe. I think everyone likely knows you, but if you want to introduce yourself, Oriana, we're just kind of wrapping up a roundtable discussion and about to get into the written feedback that folks submitted to us.
Hi all, my name is Oriana Manera. I'm the Energy, Climate, and Transportation Manager at Verde. Apologies for being late and excited to be here.
Great. And Oriana, we just wrapped up a roundtable discussion, so we're a little ahead of schedule, so I'll circle back on that for a minute for you if you have any thoughts, had some prompting questions, if there's a primary issue that you or your organization thinks we should be certain to surface for the legislature. We sort of had a discussion about that. And then what else is missing? Are there any issues that you think might be missing from this effort from what you've seen from us so far? So we just had a bit of an open table discussion of those issues for the last half an hour. Not to put you on the spot, but if you have any thoughts, feel free to let us know.
Sure, I'll jump in. And I think I haven't been fully added to this list because I didn't get a calendar invite, nor did I get the content in advance. So apologies. I think I can still jump in though with something that may be missing, which would be the equity impacts of siting of transmission. If you're looking at a regional transmission organization, that's necessarily going to expand infrastructure significantly. So we can't lose those local community impacts that come from that kind of regionalization and expansion, especially for agricultural communities and tribes that have historical and cultural resources.
Yes, thank you for that feedback. And I apologize on the invite and information. We will follow up after and figure out what happened there. But I'm glad you were able to join us.
Hey, Adam, this is Ruchi. One question that might be helpful to share is if the literature review, as it continues to be refined, and whether and when it'll be likely be posted on the website.
Yeah, I'm not, TBD, I think. Certainly it'll be part of the final report, so the draft report, when it goes around, will have the literature review in it. But if there is interest, so certainly the advisory committee members have seen the draft literature review. But if others are interested, feel free to email me, I suppose is probably the best way. I don't know if, since it's sort of in draft form, I wasn't planning on putting it on the website necessarily.
Great. So it sounds like as it's being refined, when it gets more closer to final, it'll be shared on the website. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Thanks for that clarification. So thanks to those who were able to fill out the responses on our online portal. We had, as part of this effort, trying to kind of use a couple of different mechanisms to gather feedback and perspectives. We thought it'd be interesting to ask a few survey questions to sort of see if there was some overlap and anything kind of could be identified around sort of what folks on the advisory committee see as the most important issues that kind of stand out. So the first question we asked was around asking folks to identify their top 3 potential benefits from a list that we provided. So I thought this was pretty interesting. We sort of had an overwhelming two items floated to the top here. First being economic dispatch of generators lowering system cost was identified as the #1 potential benefit of most interest to advisory committee members, followed by potentially improved mechanisms to develop interregional transmission solutions. And then you can sort of see on down the list. So sorry, I should have labeled this here. The numbers at right are the number of times an entity selected that issue among their top 3. So, and then similarly, we asked a similar kind of question about perceived challenges. And here, the one that came to the top was a potential erosion of state or regulatory authority. And then a couple others sort of bunched up there next. Uncertainty about whether an RTO will actually result in lower retail costs. That probably partly comes back to sort of in the abstract hypothetical without a concrete proposal, makes it hard to evaluate that. Conversion of legacy contract rights for transmission was certainly an issue. And then reduction of revenues for transmission owners. So those were sort of the issues that rose to the top. I thought that was sort of an interesting snapshot to see what folks were thinking.
Hey, Adam, I want to ask a question about this specific question. When I was trying to answer this question, the question is, please identify the top 3 perceived challenges or barriers. So I answered it as if I was saying, these might not be the barriers that I think exist, but these are what I think are the perceived challenges. I'm just interested if others answered it differently. There's anyone who saw this differently?
Nicole, we sort of took probably an overly legalistic approach and addressed it in terms of the legal or regulatory requirements, not so much the big substantive or political barriers. So it's possible, Adam, that people did take a few different approaches given the wording.
Yeah, but it was mostly for fun. I certainly got a lot more substance. Obviously in the written feedback to the questions. I just thought it'd be an interesting snapshot to see if anything jumped out. So thank you for taking my survey. And with that, I was going to give a little bit of before we really dig into the questions. The remaining slides are really going to be focused on the comments we received from the advisory committee. Certainly, we also reviewed feedback that came in from others who are not on the advisory committee. I want to let you know that we certainly heard that, we read that. It will be incorporated in the final report, but for today's purposes, we're really going to be focused on the feedback that we heard from the advisory committee. And our purpose, again, as I've stated already, is really trying to help us crystallize our understanding of the perspectives that are out there so we can accurately represent those to the legislature. And again, as I stated earlier, our purpose, as we see it, is not to reconcile those potentially opposing perspectives to formulate recommendations. So just to make that clear. So as we kind of go through the slides ahead, that really try to summarize the comments and the feedback we got to the questions, a few prompting questions that we suggest to help guide the conversation. Think about, do you support or oppose a perspective that's represented? Would you emphasize something differently? Is there something missing? So I sort of envisioning this sort of in the way you might do response comments to something, say in a docket at the PUC sort of thing, it just helps to understand sort of where those differences of perspective are so that we can characterize them for the legislature. And again, our objective statement, just to restate that before we dive back in here, we really see it as to gather and synthesize the range of perspectives on the benefits, costs, opportunities, challenges, and risks of RTO formation that exist among a diverse range of Oregon stakeholders to inform the legislature and other interested parties. So there were a couple, not surprisingly, a couple of pieces of general feedback that I certainly heard that didn't necessarily align with individual questions that I just wanted to call out. The first one will look familiar because it's come up several times already. Several members identified certainly the difficulty in answering the questions without a concrete framework for a market design. So certainly understand that, and that obviously the particulars and the detailed elements of that sort of market design would potentially have significant impacts on outcomes. So we certainly heard that feedback, and it's important feedback to think. And as one member suggested, that uncertainty until there's an actual market design proposed is potentially a good reason to forgo additional technical analysis. So one of the questions we asked was around trying to understand whether there would be need for a kind of a specific Oregon technical analysis. In context, it's our hope, as certainly we heard from some of the commenters, the type of feedback provided will provide helpful context and baseline information to help the state and interested stakeholders better understand the issues implicated in RTO formation. And this, I debated bringing this up in the roundtable discussion. We had a few extra minutes, but I thought this was an interesting question that was raised. We kind of charge into this effort. The legislature is asking us to consider issues around RTO formation without really even pausing on the question of what problem are we trying to solve, right? Well, we're talking about sort of some of the issues potentially involved, looking at studies out there without really spending too much time on this kind of more foundational question of why are we even discussing this topic? So it's something I'd be interested in hearing feedback from the committee on. Either we could talk about it now, we could do it later, but I thought it was a good basic question that is worth having out there. So the first question, as you all know, was around legal barriers. And look here. So the question really was, are you aware of any legal barriers to Oregon entities joining a regional transmission organization? And so I'll mention here, I have about 20 minutes set aside for each of these questions. Some of the questions probably will warrant more discussion than others. Others we might go through kind of quickly. This first one I suspect will probably be a little quicker. So just throwing that out there, I'm fine with taking longer on a question if we have more to say. So some general feedback here, of course, maybe an obvious one, and it's inherent to the question, sort of not stated as well as it could have been probably. Just important to acknowledge the different types of organizations, and really it was meant to be referencing entities that operate in Oregon, not necessarily Oregon entities. But certainly there is a range of different organizations we're talking about here: PUC jurisdictional utilities, consumer-owned utilities who are not PUC jurisdictional, independent power producers, and of course, federal entities like Bonneville. So obviously, sort of the lens you have to look at that legally is going to change dramatically across those different entities. Several members certainly identified that while there might not be explicit legal barriers, which is something we heard from several commenters, that there were no explicit legal barriers, there are clear regulatory requirements, certainly, from the PUC and from FERC. Existing contractual legal rights were certainly also raised, particularly regarding transmission service as a potential barrier. Now, certainly, there was specific feedback about Bonneville in particular. One commenter did want us to know and noted for us that WAPA, another Federal Power Marketing Administration, is a full member of the Southwest Power Pool, just as a point of reference. And then in terms of Bonneville's statutory obligations, it was pointed out that the Energy Policy Act of 2005 expressly authorizes Bonneville to join an RTO if doing so is, quote, consistent with its statutory obligations, which were expounded upon. 3 in particular, the administrator must retain control of federal transmission. Although it sounds like previous RTO efforts had explored this and potentially identified mechanisms that would be consistent with this. The federal Columbia River Power System cannot be subject to must-run obligations by an RTO. And third, that participation in an RTO that dispatches resources according to security-constrained economic dispatch could potentially create challenges for Bonneville in meeting its preference obligations. And feel free to stop me on any of these. I can also kind of get through the feedback for one particular question, and then we can have a discussion about all of them or whatever makes sense as the topic might warrant. So feel free to jump in at any point. In terms of the investor-owned utilities, multiple commenters agreed the Oregon PUC certainly has a regulatory oversight responsibility in this area, primarily to understand if RTO entry by our IOUs will be just, reasonable, and in the public interest. Multiple utility members went further and identified specific sections of the Oregon revised statutes that may be implicated, including 747.480, which requires PUC approval, quote, in order to allow any other entity to operate any public utility property or perform any service as a public utility. One commenter cautioned that IUs might also have to unwind their current vertically integrated systems. And a multi-state utility would likely be required to receive approval from regulators in each state that it operates. In terms of transmission, implications for FERC, any proposed transfer of operational control of transmission facilities to an RTO would require FERC approval pursuant to Section 203 of the Federal Power Act. And then the issue of legacy transmission rights, which we certainly was identified earlier, may be necessary to review contractual transmission rights and whether those rights must be assigned to an RTO, and if so, the steps for doing so. And then it was pointed out, sections 217 and 218 of the Federal Power Act specifically address physical transmission rights held in the Western interconnection and the Northwest in particular, requiring the consent of load-serving entities to convert those physical transmission rights to tradable or financial rights. And that's so that's what we had for question 1 on legal barriers. Any comments or questions or additional feedback, clarifications on any of those issues? Again, this is, I think, probably one of the easier questions, but we might have more to discuss on the others.
Hey, Adam, it's Spencer. Just one point of clarification. WAPA, unlike Bonneville, has 5 regions within the PMA that operate across the West, and it's one particular region of WAPA that is a full member of SPP.
Yeah. That's one of the challenges of quickly reviewing, distilling comments and trying to get them into a bullet point. But thank you for flagging.
Sure.
Adam, this is Mike with CUB. Not a barrier per se, but maybe an additional legal consideration. And I know some of the questions kind of focused on, ensuring benefits accrue to Oregonians as, in kind of promulgating an RTO. And I would just caution that, and I think a lot of comments kind of reflect this and people are on board, but, governance and kind of design of an RTO that's going to be across a region needs to be done in concert with other states and with other entities. And the reason I bring this up is if we were to pass a bill that were to, potentially legislatively mandate that certain benefits flow to Oregonians, and it also implicated interstate commerce, I think we could, run afoul of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution and be susceptible to some sort of legal challenge there. So just not doing it legislatively, but kind of working on governance principles through coalition building, I think would be the right path.
Thank you, Mike. Any other comments or feedback on question number 1 on some of these potential legal barriers? We apologize. It sounds like our hand raising function is not working properly. So I'm not sure what's going on there. So we'll have to go with the.
It works. It just shows up in the participant list. If you raise your hand shows up in the participant list. You have to have that open.
Okay. We'll go with the continuing to jump in, I think. Or you could also physically raise your hand, I suppose. All right. So question number 2. So this question was really focused on, could we identify, there are all these technical studies out there looking at RTO formation across the West. Of course, plenty of them are inclusive of Oregon. But questions have been raised around whether there is a need to specifically look at any technical analysis of trying to project the benefits to Oregon in particular. So that's what this question was really trying to get at. Are there reasons to believe why these benefits may be greater or lesser in Oregon in particular, separate from those regional evaluations that are out there? So some of the feedback we got here, general feedback, I think most but not all commenters seem to generally agree with the literature that regional integration and coordination can reduce system costs, as a very high level general comment. One commenter certainly suggested, however, that the complexities of modeling the existing bilateral system may result in technical studies of RTO formation that could actually overestimate the benefits compared to the status quo. I saw some other comments, and certainly I've seen in some of the studies out there a suggestion the opposite, that potential to underestimate. So and there's definitely a range of perspectives there. And in some cases, it's been pointed out that cost may simply be shifting from one customer group to another. And I think we've already heard some of this feedback during the workshop today. Multiple commenters urged a collaborative process with regional stakeholders to ensure costs and benefits are allocated equitably across the region, as opposed to an exclusive focus on a single state. So I think certainly that's most of the efforts out there have been looking regionally to date. And then also, this has also come up today, there may be complications with estimating state-specific benefits due to the physical regional interconnectedness of the grid. All that notwithstanding, there were plenty of comments on some potential opportunities for Oregon-specific benefits. One commenter noted, as a result of Oregon's reliance on thermal resources compared to, say, its neighbor in Washington, it's, quote, more likely that Oregon consumers would see net benefits from an RTO. As a potential exporter of clean energy, Oregon could benefit from lower wheeling charges across the region as a result of RTO formation. And multiple commenters expect that access to more diverse resources across a broader footprint to serve in-state load would benefit Oregon. And then in terms of Oregon-specific costs, the potential was identified for a reversion to the mean across the region, with customers who currently pay less for power and transmission, such as many in Oregon, ending up paying more, while customers who currently pay more, such as in the CAISO, might end up paying less as prices converge regionally. So kind of related to that, uniform transmission costs, for example, was identified as one area in particular where this could adversely impact Oregon customers. And one commenter noticed that in low hydro years, in particular, Oregon customers could be more exposed to greater rate variability driven by increased dispatch of resources with a fuel cost. I feel inclined to stop on this page before moving on to the rest of question 2 to see if there's any feedback midway before I keep going. But I'm happy to go through the rest of the feedback for question 2 and then talk all at once again like we did before. Okay, I will keep going. So some other potential Oregon-specific concerns that were highlighted: local control. Concerns were identified about diluting the value of local control, particularly with consumer utilities, if they were to join a regional RTO with load-based governance structure. Transmission congestion. There's a perception that Oregon, quote, experiences relatively little transmission congestion, and that a well-designed RTO should mitigate against inequitably shifting costs to Oregon customers to relieve transmission congestion outside of Oregon. Out-of-market actions. One commenter noted RTOs often supplement their markets with out-of-market capacity mechanisms to ensure sufficient capacity, while the status quo in the region may offer, quote, a more efficient and certain mechanism for doing this. And then in terms of, we asked a specific question about equity, and at least one commenter expressed that they were not aware of any specific risks to underserved and low-income communities associated specifically with RTO formation. And it was noted by another that out-of-market processes may evolve to address specific considerations for underserved and low-income communities where the design of an RTO administered market optimization may not be the appropriate mechanism.
Adam, can I ask a question about the second bullet under the other potential concerns? Transmission congestion. There's a perception that Oregon experiences relatively little transmission congestion, and that a well-designed RTO should mitigate against inequitably shifting costs to Oregon customers to relieve transmission congestion. I'm a little lost on this one, to be honest. I mean, my initial response here is that an RTO is not designed to shift costs from one state, or transmission congestion from one state to another. So I don't know. I'm just hoping somebody could shed light on what the concern is here. And I mean, I haven't talked to anyone that thinks Oregon doesn't experience transmission congestion.
Thank you, Nicole. I would open that up if anyone has feedback. You know, I sort of neutralized the phrasing of these comments, so I didn't associate them on the screen here with particular commenters, but certainly some of these comments came from a particular set of comments. So someone may recognize the comment and wish to clarify or add some more information, but.
I mean, oh, did someone want to speak? Sorry. I guess one comment I would just add here is that, I mean, the idea of a sort of regional transmission planning and you know, energy dispatch market is not the idea behind it, but one of the benefits of it is you have a much better understanding of where the transmission congestion is on a regional basis. Sort of sends the price signals to the places where we need the relief the most. And should that situation identify that there's more congestion in, like, let's say Oregon versus another place, the idea wouldn't be that all of a sudden Oregon has to pay for all those additional upgrades that are needed to that system. The idea would be that those costs and that investment is spread out over the entire market. So I guess I just want to make sure that's kind of understood. And maybe someone could correct me if I'm wrong there.
This isn't from the OPUC's comments, but I'll just reflect that I think what I sometimes hear when I'm in regulator forums is a sense that spreading out means my customers will pay for an upgrade somewhere else that doesn't directly benefit them, and that they wouldn't have had to pay for if I wasn't in an RTO. So I think that's that perception. Now, the flip is also true, right? If Oregon is congested, then the upgrade costs are peanut buttered across more customers. So I think there's if I had to guess, it's not my comments, but what I hear in other forums would lead me to think that's the sense of the concern. And that's why, from my perspective, those questions about governance and ongoing discussions about cost allocation, you don't see an ISO or an RTO in the country that has finished their cost allocation discussions for that reason.
Thank you, Letha. That's very helpful. And I think that also points to this first bullet where it talks about the diluting the value of a local control. I mean, this is more on, we're talking about transmission, but with a load-based governance structure, I just want to point out that there are other options out there besides just a load-based governance structure. And for those who don't know what that would mean, that would be basically your ability to provide input or have a say in the governance structure would be directly tied to the number of customers you have or the size of your load. And there are other models out there. And like Letha said, they're still kind of working out details of a lot of this cost allocation issue across different markets. So much to be learned here.
Hey, Nicole, this is Frank. I think that was eWeb's comment related to transmission congestion, not that we don't think there's not transmission congestion in Oregon. I think it was actually, as Commissioner Tani described, it was a perceived socialization of costs. If you're in a good position entering an RTO versus in a challenged position, there can be a perception that you're going to be sort of pulled up or pulled down. And so that was the basis of the comment, not necessarily specific to, oh, there's no transmission. I think it does get back to the importance of some of, how the market gets designed, the governance in particular, and how that works. It really just, I think we were trying to point out the importance of that. So that's just a little clarification on where that came from.
Thanks, Frank. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Frank.
Adam, this is Robert. I think the second half of that statement, as Frank alluded to, really is the essence of the comment. A well-designed RTO should mitigate the problems that are raised.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask a follow-up question on, I'm happy to talk about that issue further, but the out-of-market actions. There's a lot of discussion nationally, frankly, about sort of the, I'm curious to get perspectives from the advisory committee on, does an RTO need to solve all of our problems, or are we comfortable with the need for out-of-market actions for things like capacity planning and procurement, which happens in most RTOs? I suppose when I think about RTOs and read the literature, I don't expect an RTO to be designed to sufficiently procure and plan for capacity needs. I see it as typically they're designed to efficiently dispatch the resources that are there as cost effectively as possible. So I'm just curious if there's any more discussion on that point, sort of what are the perspectives there on, the need for out-of-market capacity planning? Is that, how much of a barrier is that?
Hey, Adam, it's Sarah. I'm just going to take a general approach to your question and not necessarily go on a deep dive on RA capacity or capacity markets per se, but I think the answer, at least for me generally, is I really hope that we don't want the market to solve all of our problems, because we will never get there.
Yeah.
We just will never get there. There are some things that make sense to embed in the market, particularly those items that respond best to the economic signals of supply and demand. There are some more difficult things that have made sense in other places to do out of market, particularly if there's a variance among states about how to do certain things. And the real fear that I've had for a while is any specific state policies or legislation that seek to embed themselves inside the market, but we cannot accommodate all of that. We can't accommodate multiple states views on a market signal. Let's say, for example, if we have multiple views on the cost of carbon, that's a real tough one that's hard to do inside of the market for all views in all states. And generally speaking, we have some comments in our set of joint utility comments that address the need for potential out-of-market solutions. I really would caution against hoping that the market, you can just plug it all in and it'll come out in a way that makes everybody mostly happy. I don't even think that's maybe reasonable.
So Sarah, I don't know the basis for the bullet itself, but what are your thoughts on the fact that an RTO or some kind of footprint could provide clarification around imports and exports and seams issues, since it's not utility by utility, but it's now sort of a group, I'll say a group effort. Like you said, maybe not everybody's happy in that effort, but an RTO can provide some clarification for how to solve some of these problems or the scope of them, as opposed to an individual utility effort.
Yeah, I mean, I look at what's going on right now in the region. So, look to the Western Resource Adequacy Program provided by the Northwest Power Pool, and assuming that continues to move forward and that it advances to all of the functionality that is envisioned there, I see really any market solution, whether it's RTO or something less than, as a potential complement to the foundational RA requirements, where you can connect those RA foundational planning pieces to an optimization engine that is able to give you a better economic solution in the day ahead and real-time timeframes associated with which resources you've committed for those needs. So I see it more as not the provider of RA necessarily, but as maybe a more efficient engine that RA can be connected to. And to the extent that foundational piece is transparent about how it treats imports and exports, what it's assuming there, how it's counting resources, and I think you get what you're looking for out of it. In some places in the nation, the RA program did come from the market operator. In other places, look to the CAISO, it's coming from the California agencies. They've partnered with CAISO to provide some of the market engine functions around that.
Yeah, thank you.
Adam, I was going to jump in on this out-of-market capacity mechanism question.
Great.
I think it could be helpful for the report to separate out for the legislature the existence of capacity markets as a function of RTOs in other parts of the country stemmed from a decision by those states to compel their utilities, or in some cases, the utilities themselves decided to divest from having generation. And so the need to have some other mechanism other than a traditional utility procurement process to acquire capacity contracted for or owned was the basis for forming a capacity mechanism in the first place in an RTO. In MISO and SPP, that mandatory capacity function doesn't exist, and they've sidestepped the need for the out-of-market capacity constructs that have really bedeviled PJM, New York, and New England. ERCOT and CAISO have handled this differently too, without a capacity market. So separating that out, I think, for Oregonians to understand that's not a necessity, and given the status of the structure of the industry and the state, it's probably not even an obvious option for Oregon. And that point, I think, is emphasized by the fact that we have this regional RA program that's about to launch, serving much of the same function.
Hey, Adam, this is Ben. Spencer beat me to this a little bit, but I was going to say, I think a lot of the markets that have evolved over time have really started without a capacity function. I'm not aware of any of them that started out as that being the first, at the origination of the market, something that was there. MISO does have a backstop, so they will go out and procure if the utilities don't come in sufficient up to a certain measure. So there's some creative ways people have done this very differently throughout the US and throughout the world. I guess the one thing I would say on the benefit side, though, is that none of those mechanisms are really, they're possible, but they're a little bit different. And I think the Northwest Power Pool is having that sort of realization as well without having an RTO. So having an RTO does enable, you know, creative collaboration down the road, but I don't think it necessitates that you start there. At least I'm unaware of any example of a market that did start there. And I think it's just worth pointing out that it enables some collaborative results that cross state lines that are done in a way with local control in different markets throughout the US, like SPP and MISO for sure. And that every market kind of has a different approach to this one. I mean, California and Texas are really hard examples because they're completely contained. So I don't think I'd point either of those as kind of an illustrative thing. I don't think that's what Oregon is looking at in this effort.
All good points. Thank you for the discussion there. I thought that was an important point to follow up on. It's a kind of a constant issue that gets circulated. So I think having some discussion there is good for the legislature. Any other feedback or thoughts on this question 2? And I'm happy to flip back to some of the previous slides if it's helpful. Otherwise, I have a 10-minute break scheduled next before we get into question 3.
Adam, just one other thought on the equity considerations bullets, and maybe this is in a later slide you have, but this is something we put in our comments. It could be useful for the report to delve into a little bit of what the RTOs are doing nationally on aggregation of distributed resources. I really think that's an area of innovation that the RTOs have jumped into on their own, encouraged by FERC, and are figuring out ways to aggregate distributed resources that I think are well suited for underserved communities to have more economic development in a way that feeds them back into the wholesale market and gives them a price signal that does not exist in the Northwest right now.
That's good feedback, and I think that was one of your questions further on the list, further on down that I plan to talk about at our next workshop. It's kind of the downside of how I structured this. Is no, that's right. It's a good point, and there's an equity nexus there, certainly.
Hey, Adam, this is Nicole. I'm sorry, I dropped off the call just for a bit, and I don't know if this was already mentioned, but just in the broader conversation of equity considerations in Oregon, I think this goes back also to the importance of a governance structure, which allows voices that we haven't, historically seen represented in market development in the process of considering these issues.
Can you talk more about that, Nicole? What I'm just curious to have you expound on that a little bit. What, are there, in your view, good or better ways to do this? Markets that are more inclusive or less inclusive, and what voices do you think need to be heard more?
So I think, I sent you a report that I think is a really good one for everyone else to read. It was a report done by Exeter Associates for the New England States Committee on Electricity. And it's basically just a summary of all the different types of governance structures out there. And as I have been reviewing it, actually, I think there's people on this call that are much more qualified to answer this question than I am. But I'd say a governance structure that has a truly independent board and one that has opportunities for what we'll call non-market participants. So non-utilities, non-loan serving entities, non-load responsible entities to participate. And participation means, it could mean being involved on a program review committee, or as something similar to a regional issues forum in the EIM sense of the term, where stakeholders have an opportunity to make sure their voices are heard and they have feedback on certain proposals. And then the other way stakeholders could have a voice in how the market is formed and how the market evolves is by having participation in the process of nominating board members. And in the EIM sense of the term, that translates to a nominating committee that has representation of non-market participants on it. So the, inclusion of individuals or sectors of the industry that focus on issues like equity and making sure that customers, the benefits of the RTO flow to customers would be an important addition.
So I'll jump in after that. I think there's actually a different way to approach it, which is that it's not enough to just have diverse stakeholders participating. If there's not actually decision-making power for an organization or a community like the ones that Verde serves, or for a tribal government, then it's not meaningful participation. But I'm really glad, Nicole, that you mentioned governance, because I think that is really where you can get to the heart of ensuring that benefits and burdens are balanced. I have a lot of concerns about the comment that there's no specific risks to underserved and low-income communities. I think there are certainly risks with any market formation for communities being undervalued. Spencer brought up the issue of aggregating distributed energy resources. That's something that we're certainly very interested in as we develop community benefiting projects. Having community ownership through like a renewable energy cooperative of a project that can then be sold on the market really increases the value of that project to the cooperative members and can build wealth in a community in a really meaningful way. So ensuring that there are opportunities is one thing that could happen through a board or governance structure. And I'll talk a little bit more, I think, where the equity opportunities are there, but that's one example of a benefit. A burden, again, is just if you have expanded transmission to accommodate regional needs and load, or you have new market participants, ensuring that there's some equity in the way they're engaging with the communities who are impacted by the infrastructure. Because I think the problem with an RTO is it's a very high level regional organization, and that loses the on the ground community impact. So you need some way to value that. And I think that happens at the governance level by having two potential advisory bodies that aren't just there to advise, but also have some decision-making power. And I can't quite speak to what that would look like yet. One would be like an equity advisory body that would be include members from communities who are transmission impacted or are attempting to develop projects for communities in impactful ways, but aren't necessarily market entrants or utilities. I think what Nicole was saying about that piece is really important, is that someone who's outside the interests of the system, but may be impacted by the system. The other important advisory body would be one that allows tribal governments who are part of our region, but not necessarily participants in our power system, but who are very impacted by transmission, either positively or negatively, and it does go both ways, having some opportunity for tribal governments to have representatives, and acknowledging that not all tribal governments can speak for other tribal governments, that they're not a monolith, but still having some avenue through which the sovereign nations that are in the Northwest can have participation, either to create new opportunities for their communities or to raise concerns about how a potential RTO or the actions of an RTO or specific market participants in an RTO are impacting communities. Beyond that, you can build in some requirements for an entity to be a market participant, that they can't have projects that are disputed by tribes or communities, or that kind of can go into the governance as well, as ensuring that all participants are adhering by a set of equity principles, and ensuring that the communities who are impacted by the transmission system and impacted by our power system more broadly are either benefiting, especially at the aggregated distributed energy resources level, or are not burdened at the higher level. So sorry if that kept folks from break, but did want to just jump in and share a little bit more about where I see equity opportunities, and I think there are a lot here.
Yeah, no apology. That's great, and we're well ahead of schedule, so happy to have more discussion on this. Any other comments on Oregon-specific costs and benefits and the feedback we sort of summarized here? If not, we can take a break before we get into question 3.
Hey, Adam, this is Frank. I just, in listening to Nicole and Ariana, there's a lot of aspects to this that fall back on governance. And it just points out to me that this will be one of the big areas of tension, and the difference between input, influence, and control across a multi-jurisdictional kind of area is going to be a big challenge. In an area that quite honestly has sort of been the Wild West for a while. So I think if you look back at some of the history, that's been a challenge on a number of different sort of approaches to organizing the region. And so I think it's a great opportunity to look at things like equity, to look at how you handle reliability in markets and the other things about it. But it also places a pretty heavy burden on the development of the governance approach. So I just think that governance is going to be incredibly important. It's also going to be an area of tension.
Thank you, Frank. I definitely see that. So I appreciate it, the challenge with some of these questions, the interrelatedness of all these issues, certainly. But certainly governance will be a major topic of conversation for us. So with that, let's take a break. So it's 2:37. Why don't we come back at 2:50 at 10 of 3, so 13 minutes. And we'll see you in a few minutes for question 3. Thank you.
Hey, Adam, I'm gonna have to drop off a little bit before 5, like at 4:30. Sorry about that.
We're running a little ahead of schedule, so
Okay.
we'll see how long it goes. If folks could turn their cameras back on, at least temporarily, so I can know you're back. Wait till we see a fair number of you before we get started here. See, Frank's moved outside to work on some lines.
It's good weather to do it.
It's true. Although the rain was nice.
I'm not quite to the top of the poll yet. Just give me a few more minutes.
It's a busy poll there.
Yeah, it was visually interesting.
All right. Well, I will go ahead and get us started. Back to our questions here. Question number 3. So I just also wanted to reiterate as we go through these, some of the prompting questions I had up on the screen earlier, just to think about, do you support or oppose perspectives that are represented? Would you emphasize something differently? Is there something missing? So sort of some key prompting questions there to think about. So question number 3 is really focused on Oregon retail customers. So certainly a lot of the studies and reports identify quantitative benefits from RTO formation. So this question was really trying to get more at how those benefits could be, how we could see through those benefits directly benefiting Oregon's retail customers. So some general feedback here. Again, similar to the last question, most but not all commenters seem to generally agree with some of the major findings of the literature that RTO formation can reduce overall costs after accounting for the costs associated with RTO administration and operation. There was one comment that there's potential for there to be a delay in retail customers realizing net benefits from RTO formation until after several years of operational experience, partly there, I think, associated with startup costs. Cost versus modeled benefits. This issue came up several times from different commenters. One commenter contends that actual costs should be included to offset reported benefits, which are difficult to measure because of the need to compare what operational decisions a utility may have made in a counterfactual scenario were they not participating in an RTO. Another commenter argued that projected future benefits should be weighed against the proposed cost to calculate the net benefits for Oregon customers. And multiple commenters identified the rate-making principle of cost causation as being important to ensure an equitable distribution of costs. An example of that, given utilities seeking to improve reliability or to interconnect new generation should be responsible for the associated transmission costs for doing so, while minimizing the cost impacts to other participants. So again, I'll give the opportunity to pause here. There's a lot of information on this one slide. Or if I don't hear immediate feedback, I'm happy to move on to the rest of the feedback to this question, and we can take it all at once.
I don't know if it was the break, Adam, or what, but what were those prompts that you had at the beginning?
Oh, I don't have them in front of me at the moment. Do you support or oppose the statements here? Would you emphasize something differently, or what's missing? So the what's missing could be very well on the next slide. So that one's a bit tricky until I go through all of them.
Yeah, for the reminder.
So potential costs. So this was, I forget which of our commenters, I know one of them kind of listed off some of the costs associated with RTO formation. So certainly institutional costs around starting up a market, administrative and operational costs around the RTO. There may be technology costs associated with building or enhancing a market engine to model the new market. Market participants may need to make investments in metering upgrades and other equipment to interface with the market. Allocation of costs for existing transmission and investments in new transmission. Costs for market exports and out-of-market transactions. And then potential benefits. Reduce net power costs. RTO can optimize transmission, generation, congestion, and reliability coordination while incorporating transmission constraints to dispatch generators on a least cost basis. Reduction in reserves. Day-ahead market optimization by an RTO can reduce the amount of generation needed to be online to maintain reserves for reliability. Managing imbalances. Real-time least cost dispatch to minimize the cost for handling imbalances. Lower cost integration of renewables. Can lower the cost of entry and open more opportunities for smaller scale projects to compete. And types of benefits, measuring both the tangible and the avoided cost benefits of RTO formation. And then we get to the kind of the real thrust of this question was around benefit flow through to retail customers. Multiple commenters contend that to ensure net benefits reach customers, benefits should flow through power costs or other automatic cost recovery true-up mechanisms. Utility incentives. The independent dispatch of resources by an RTO effectively removes, quote, a utility's incentive to operate efficiently to maximize profit. It may make, quote, sharing mechanisms, earnings tests, etc., unnecessary as a result. There's a comment from one commenter. And then, of course, multiple commenters highlighted clear role for the PUC in this respect. Having a mechanism to ensure benefits directly flow to retail customers could be established by the PUC as a condition for IOU joining an RTO. Oregon regulators need to, quote, have a seat at the table during conversations related to RTO formation and a meaningful regulatory role within the RTO itself. And one commenter noted that perhaps customer retail rates can be characterized as the, quote, ultimate measuring stick to evaluate the benefits to retail customers. So it was quite a bit there. That was the genesis of the feedback we received on question 3, focused on Oregon retail customers. So I will open up for feedback, thoughts here. Again, anything you feel strongly about that you support or oppose, emphasize differently, or something missing. And thank you, Representative Marsh, for the dedication. I see you there on the floor.
Hey, Adam, Spencer here. I think on this question, I would separate out impacts on residential ratepayers and commercial and industrial. And speaking for the part of the market that's suppliers of power to large customers, industrial and commercial, part of the value proposition of an RTO for that customer class is the ability to reduce integration costs of renewables that they want to procure or other resources to through a direct contract with the retail supplier. And I think that set of the literature review that looks at integration costs for resources directly serving retail choice load is a different set of issues than a pass-through mechanism or some other question about residential retail rates on the power side. So just to distinguish between those two, I guess, for the larger group.
Thank you, Spencer.
It's Fred Hewitt. Hi.
Hi, Fred.
So this is one of those imponderable questions. There's been, lots of studies of benefit or net benefit from markets, including some run by the markets themselves. California ISO publishes their EIM quarterly update. MISO Midcontinent ISO publishes, I think, an annual report. It always shows several $billion in net benefits. And I think those studies are legitimate. The question is, how accurate are they? There are a lot of imponderables in this. And many of the studies, including the state-led market option study that, as I just saw this morning, is now finally got its final release. do a lot, but recognize that they don't do everything in assessing the question. So I think my general sense is, on balance, markets have shown to give benefits, but there are also times when you have to wonder. And what happened in Texas in February is a good example of what happened in California a couple decades ago, but even some ongoing things. I think that the influence of elevated pricing in the Southern California gas market has significantly increased the costs in the power market, including spillovers here to the Northwest. There is some investigation going on with that in California. Don't know if it's going to turn out. What I'm really saying is that there are price risks in markets that we have to pay attention to. And market design is really important for protecting customers over the long run from a situation which may be fine 99.5% of the time, and that 0.5% of the time can really hit you hard. So we have to be very aware of that factor. But and then that's, you know, considering the kind of the macro level, then the question of how those benefits flow down to customers in our bills is another layer of this. And there are obviously some complicated questions we're going to have to work through.
Thank you, Fred. Curious, are there good, better, best examples out there from other RTOs that anyone knows about and is interested in flagging? Just curious what's.
Well, this is Fred again. There are a lot of studies that have been done. One of the things I wish had been done more is, you know, more of an independent review in some of the existing markets, particularly. We've had a long time with them now, and it's not an easy thing to do, I realize, but this is something FERC probably should have taken up a long time ago. There was kind of a assumption that FERC would do a review of market benefits, you know, a couple decades ago when all this really began getting off the ground, and they've never done it. So would an independent study, you know, by FERC or by an academic organization or think tank or whatever, that was, you know, pretty balanced and pretty thorough, you know, focusing on an existing market or a market, you know, proposed market, would that provide some additional value? Yeah, but then again, you're right back to the question of what assumptions get made, what models are being used, and what, you know, what end value can we get out of it? But I think there are some good examples. I think that the CAISO EIM study is good for what it does. The MISO study, I've looked at it, it's pretty good for what it does. But again, you always have to wonder, is something being left out?
Fred, can you comment, maybe expand on your something might be left out? You mentioned that twice.
Well, I'll give an example. The state-led market options study, now people are calling it the Utah study. It wasn't just Utah, but nonetheless, very explicitly says, you know, here's the things we're looking at, and here are the categories that we cannot really deal with here because we have limited time or, you know, analytical capability. And here are some issues that we are not going to quantify for various reasons. Typically, reliability benefits are a big part of that. And they're fundamentally difficult questions analytically difficult questions underneath. What's the loss of load? You know, what is the value of lost load? That's a kind of a technical term. I'm not happy with any of the analytical assessments of that. Texas hasn't served them well, you know, but is that a real thing? Yeah, it surely is. But there's value judgments under a lot of that make it difficult to do the analysis for things that aren't directly observed as transactions in the market.
Any other thoughts or feedback on this question?
You know, Adam, I'd reflect that when I talk to my regulator colleagues around the country, within a couple of years of being in an RTO, the conversation switches into this is the status quo. Is it serving us? And is there something better, right? That the question flips. I think that's why, you know, Fred's pointing to a lack of studies, but I think that's why they're hard, but also because the frame of reference just changes. And so this is a question, when you step in, it rapidly stops being framed quite the same once you are in. And so that sort of argues, as many things have so far, to getting the rules set up in such a way as you step into the new status quo that you're going to be able to manage through what comes up, because it becomes it becomes simply the water you're swimming in at that point. And you're evaluating alternatives against that as your status quo. So I think that's part of the challenge we have when we look at other RTOs after their 20 years of history and ask this question.
All right. If I don't see any more feedback on this one, I will move on to question number 4. So question number 4, we really tried to get at some higher level feedback around principles, some of which we have talked about already today, but you know, are there high level principles, core principles that should really guide Oregon's evaluation of potential RTO formation? So this was, I kind of framed this question earlier, that was raised by one commenter, but a foundational question: can stakeholders clearly articulate what perceived or potential problem or problems exist, if any, with the current transmission operations that an RTO might solve? So sort of getting back to that question of what is the problem we're trying to solve here, before addressing the principles. But potential core principles, almost universally, the concept of independence was mentioned, although as pointed out by one commenter, it was suggested this is actually a FERC requirement for an RTO, so maybe not framing it as much as a principle, but sort of a prerequisite. Diversity of representation, fair and equitable governance structure that represents geographic and stakeholder diversity to ensure an equitable distribution of benefits, was raised by many commenters, and we've heard some of those comments here today. Balanced involvement of state regulators, governance that incorporates formalized and ongoing state regulator input, and that protects against a single state influencing rules and policies. Transparent and inclusive decision-making, transparent decision-making regarding program proposals, initiatives, and amendments that is inclusive of RTO participants and non-participants. Cost allocation, that costs shared broadly among customers based upon principles of cost causation, including for the revenue requirements of existing transmission assets. Market power, again, similar to the independence, was suggested by multiple commenters that market design should mitigate market power and disincentivize market manipulation, but that this is also something required by FERC. Reliability, any market design should strive to improve regional reliability, which may include imposing minimum resource requirements on participants. Continuation of this, state policy, market design must take into account and be compatible with state GHG and clean energy policies, which in Oregon's case means the market should facilitate cost-effective and timely decarbonization through the integration of clean energy. Resource adequacy, market design should ensure that all participants are held to a common standard for transmission and capacity planning to ensure reliability and RA. An RA standard should be applied equitably across participants and should be resource agnostic with regard to the contribution of capacity value, for example, from non-wires alternatives and distributed resources. Price formation within the market should provide appropriate compensation for the energy, capacity, and flexible attributes of resources, accurately price scarcity, and adequately reflect the opportunity costs of use-limited hydropower. And then a few comments on voluntary entry and exit. The decision to join an RTO should be voluntary, and to some extent, the decision to commit specific resources or transmission in the market should also be voluntary. There should be a reasonable withdrawal rights should an entity seek to end its participation in RTO. although one commenter notes potential for progressive erosion of internal institutional capacity, such as with transmission operations that might occur after joining an RTO. So those two slides really sum up the core principles that were suggested by commenters. Lots of agreement on many of them, but open the floor to feedback and comments here on those proposed core principles.
So this is Fred again. So the most important one I think is not listed here, which is the market ought to provide more net benefit, more value for customers in three ways. First, economically, pretty obvious, decreased costs. Secondly, from quality of service benefits, reliability, resilience. And third, environmental reduction of environmental impact, whether it's, greenhouse gas emissions or impacts, and that includes all the resources, not, any particular one. Everything has impacts. Can a market provide for a resource mix that has less impact and meets our climate and clean energy goals? So I really think, while it may just be assumed that that's a guiding principle, I think that really needs to be effectively the first is improved overall value for customers.
So Adam, this is Frank. I would echo what Fred just said. I would also say there is a transparency requirement associated with many of these attributes mentioned, which gets back somewhat to governance, but somewhat to the specific execution of them as well.
Any other comments or feedback on principles?
As I have been engaging in, what are the nascent Western states committees, I will say that the principle between not having a state be able to sort of dictate to others and some of these other principles around what we want as Oregon policy is described are a little in tension as we try to work with a larger footprint. And I think this has come up earlier in the conversation, but I think that tension is real and complex. And so the more sort of specific anyone is about what they want from an RTO, the more complex and intention that conversation with other states becomes just by its very nature. And so it's a balancing act to be aware of. These principles don't all necessarily simply exist at the same time, but are in somewhat in tension with each other.
I have a bit of a technical follow-up question, not related to that, Letha, but separately for anyone who has, for those who might not be familiar with this topic, several commenters did bring up the opportunity costs of use-limited hydropower as it relates to economic dispatch in an RTO. And I'm curious if anyone can expound on that for those who might not be familiar with that issue, sort of a uniquely Northwest one in some ways.
So this is Fred. It's a big important issue to be sure, but there's every resource has constraints. Even energy efficiency, which we all at the Northwest Energy Coalition really love because it delivers and it's very low impact. That has constraints too, not an operational sense really. It's there or it's not. But every other kind of resource, whether we call it energy limited or not, is going to, as the ESIG Energy System Integration Group says in their 6 resource adequacy principles, there is no perfect, there's no perfect capacity resource. But I think we do have to recognize the importance of the hydropower system, its really immense capabilities, but also the limitations that it's got.
And how about another technical follow-up on something here? And again, it's I'm picking on the price formation bullet here, but curious the stakeholder perspectives on accurately pricing scarcity. That's can be a hotly contested issue, whether markets have price caps or not, and just curious the perspectives of stakeholders on how important that is in an RTO to accurately price scarcity.
Well, if this is Fred again, if nobody will jump in on that one. Scarcity is it's a reality of any market. It's or of any pricing structure. I think the question is the role that it plays. You have Texas with basically a energy only market, and scarcity is a major component of what they're doing. But there are scarcity issues in all markets, and not something to be afraid of, but it's something to manage and prepare for, and that sends a useful bit of information when you have a scarcity price. But what will be done with it is a function of the design. So I think it's important to recognize that. But by the way, one other thing, maybe not a new principle, but something to consider is one of the things that the market designs have really struggled with is the relationship between short-term price, including scarcity pricing, and long-term cost, price, value, whatever you want to call it. We have a range of approaches to that, ranging from, mandatory auction, full, forward capacity markets in a couple of places in the East, to something like Texas, energy only, to California, more of an administrative model, to something in between. That relationship between short run, price discovery, market depth, and then what happens over the long run is actually very important. And I don't think anybody has really solved it. So that would mean we have a chance to tackle that and see if we can do better.
Adam, I'll pipe in on price formation. For the 3 listed types of pricing you've listed in that bullet, I think we might be able to park capacity pricing for the moment, given our previous conversation about what is more essential and less essential to market design in our region, given the status of the regional RA program. I think you could argue our bilateral approach to using nodes in the West with a standardized contract for some types of energy products does a decent job of pricing in the West. We have trackable data on what's happening to prices, when they spike, when shortages are occurring. I do think an RTO by its nature is better designed to give better information on how energy prices are being formed. To Fred's point, the design really matters, and transparency of the market matters, including having an effective market monitor. But the area that captures my attention more as an area of potential for the Northwest and for Oregon is on the flexibility of resources and coming up with better price formation mechanisms through an RTO for ancillary services to figure out what are batteries actually providing us on the grid. What is the hydro system providing in ways that aren't priced in today, as we move into a much more renewables-based and decentralized system than we have today. That seems like a key thing to zero in on for Oregon for price formation.
Thanks, Spencer, for that feedback. Any other additional comments on principles, particularly anything that's missing? That'd be good to make sure we get out there and discuss.
Hey, Adam, there's one of the principles that we included in our feedback that I didn't see here that I'd like to hear other people's perspective on is, and I have to be careful with how I talk about this because there's nuances in the terms I use. The inclusion of a regional greenhouse gas or generation resource tracking system. I'm not talking about a regional carbon market. I'm talking about some sort of regional tracking system that allows for a sort of standard mechanism for tracking resource attributes that would be complementary to existing states with carbon markets and states with clean energy standards. And so I was hoping to hear if others had views on that.
Hey, this is Mary, just from a DEQ perspective and a greenhouse gas emissions accounting perspective. I think that's one area that we really tried to highlight in our comment is that part of the development of an RTO would have to have clear transparency about emissions in Oregon and how they're being handled by who's distributing them and how we're going to handle the reporting of those emissions. So it seems like something that policy could definitely design correctly, that we could continue to accurately account for emissions, but it would have to be thoughtful in the process and how we handle unspecified power. And if we're doing something like where there's RECs or that we currently don't do. So I think I don't have a lot to say in terms of recommendations, but just that's something that definitely DEQ would be thinking about in terms of RTO formation.
And I guess maybe this is a question for Nicole as a follow-up. The concept you're talking about, how would that interface, or how would you see that interfacing with Regis's REC tracking?
That's a great question. So our tracking system here in this region only tracks the attributes of renewable generation. So it tracks the clean energy attributes or the RECs, right? There are constructs from other markets out there where you could just track generation attributes. So an example is the PJM generation attribute tracking system. And that system, I believe, and others can correct me if I'm wrong, the market operates across states with different levels of carbon mandates and clean energy standards, but seems to do a good job of providing an opportunity to track the attributes of all generation. So that helps with the acknowledgement that there are unspecified resources in the system that may have some clean attributes and may have some non-clean attributes, but you could come up with a way to track either if you're looking for the greenhouse gas value of it, or if you're looking for the clean value of it, assign a tracking mechanism to that. And then states that have clean energy standards could then say, well, this is the attribute that's being imported into the state, or this is the attribute or that unspecified power that we could apply to our carbon market, or such and so forth. The reason this came up for us recently and became an important principle was that we were seeing that states that implement clean energy standards that rely on your typical load-based accounting system that uses RECs doesn't allow you to get to 100% clean while still relying on market purchases, knowing that many of the purchases in the current market, like in the EIM, are unspecified, or all of them are unspecified, unless you're delivering into California where you specify per their carbon market the GHG value of those. And so the question came up is like, well, do we need a regional tracking system that allows us to account for the attributes of those resources as they are being imported and exported? So I'm just going to stop there. I know there's others on this call that probably have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is Fred. At the level of principles, I would say what we want out of a RTO is a process that is aligned with and follows state policy, as you already have here, and potentially federal policy. If we get the Clean Electricity Performance Program, that's going to layer in another layer on this. But the question is, can we find a way to create a framework or mechanism, whatever you want to call it, that will be able to provide compliance data for all those different kinds of policies. We think that is possible. Northwest Energy Coalition and other groups have been researching the potential for expanding the use of e-tags to do that. E-tags wouldn't have to do all of it, but could do a fair bit. And we think it's at least something worth considering, and at some length, and that there are other possibilities as well. But this is, I think, a solvable issue as long as we have a clear principle that the RTO, the market structure, will be able to provide consistent, accurate, up-to-date data in order to provide for compliance.
Yeah, and I wanted to clarify that I wasn't suggesting, and thank you, Fred, for that. I wasn't suggesting that this market or a market create a compliance mechanism, but that it creates a tracking mechanism for compliance, just as Fred said.
This is a good discussion. I suspect we could probably have a multi-day workshop just on this issue. This is being involved with these issues at Odo a little bit and tracking RECs and emissions associated with null power. It's giving some of us flashbacks, I think, a little bit, but it's an important issue.
Adam, I don't, it's an interesting area of discussion. I'm trying to think of this from a principles perspective. It almost appears like, there are attributes that don't begin and end at state borders. And whether that's for compliance or for pricing reasons, pricing in those attributes, it seems like there should be a principle that accounts for the fact, monitors for the fact that there are regional attributes that should be measured consistently across whatever the footprint is of an RTO. So to me, it has more to do with the consistency of how regional issues are handled, regional attributes in this case, as opposed to the specifics of their use. But that's just sort of trying to, in my mind, sort through this from a policy perspective, as opposed to the specifics of an attribute or carbon accounting or whatever. But it's almost like if you're dealing with a regional physics issue, then you should treat it on a regional basis and treat it consistently.
Okay, it's a good discussion. More on this topic or any of the other principles? Otherwise, I'm happy to move on to our final question on transmission.
I'll just jump in quick, sorry, with one last thing, which I think, like, as a group of very wonky people having a very wonky conversation, it's easy to forget that I think accessibility is important here. Even though this is very high level, it still has an impact on people's everyday lives. So there should be some principle of accessibility, not just for accessing the market or opportunities, regardless of the scale of generation, whether it's utility scale or the aggregated distributed energy resources. But there should be some attempt to ensure that the average person can understand basically what this is and how it benefits them, or if it has a negative impact, what that is. And I think it's also worth remembering that this is a report going to legislators, and not all of them will be energy wonks or experts. So that principle will also be important in writing the report and helping legislators who may not think this is an issue they should care about understand why this is so important and how it will impact their lives and their districts.
And this is Pam, and I would just say, yes, include those legislators in the average person category.
Thank you both. Thank you, Oriana, for that feedback. I flipped back here to this previous slide, because to me, what I'm hearing there is it's not just diversity of representation, but access for that diversity of representation, right? So yeah, you're right. That's definitely not captured here. So that's great feedback. All right. Any other additions before I move on to transmission? Sorry, we'll have to skip through these here again. Okay, question number 5 on transmission rates. So here we were looking for feedback on how potential impacts to transmission rates from RTO formation would or would not be preferable to the status quo. So trying to get some understanding of that, both in terms of impact to rates, potential impacts to transmission revenues, and then what potential solutions are out there. So general feedback, eliminating pancaked rates. The elimination of pancake transmission rates that occur when wheeling across multiple BAs is, quote, one of the main reasons to consider an RTO, is what we heard from one commenter. Because of how much power is currently wheeled bilaterally into Oregon to serve load, uniform transmission rates are expected to be a net benefit to Oregon. The elimination of pancaked rates will result in, quote, a greater utilization of Oregon's abundant hydro and wind resources. Transmission optimization using uniform rates across a broad geographic area should, quote, reduce congestion, increase reliability, and allow for more efficient use of the transmission system. Using and selling transmission, one commenter pointed out that because many utilities both use and earn revenue from transmission, RTO formation could result in both A, cost decreases for transmission usage, and B, reduced revenues from transmission sales due to a reduction in rates. And spreading risk. Multiple commenters identified RTO participation as beneficial in helping to spread the risks associated with transmission investments over a large number of participants. But that it was noted the actual winners and losers of socializing regional transmission costs depend heavily on the actual footprint of an RTO. So I'll go through here the rates, revenues, and then potential solutions, and then leave the discussion for the end. That seems to be working pretty well. In terms of impact on existing Northwest transmission rates, it was commented that end users in the Northwest, quote, generally have significantly lower costs for transmission service compared to other areas of the West, and that a uniform transmission rate could result in, quote, significant rate increases in low-cost areas. Another commenter noted that uniform rates would not automatically bring about a reduction in rates to customers. Another commented that analysis tends to indicate RTO expansion results in reduced power costs and increased transmission costs. The existing structure of pancake rates are, quote, a major source of economic inefficiency that deters the use of least cost generation resources. The transmission costs to customers are likely to decrease if the utility needs to move power across several transmission systems. Sorry, lots of detail here. Total costs, fixed costs associated with building, operating, and maintaining the existing transmission system must ultimately be recovered from end users in an RTO or otherwise. So the adoption of uniform rates would simply change how these costs are allocated. And comment about FERC's recent proposal to eliminate incentive rates for transmission owners to join an RTO would protect Oregon customers. And then we'll go through revenues and then solutions. Market design. The total impact on transmission revenues for Oregon transmission owners will depend upon market design. The state will need to ensure the market design adequately compensates transmission owners for previous investments. Opportunity for increased revenues. Multiple commenters identified the potential for increased revenues for transmission providers in Oregon. Any increased transmission revenues from RTO participation should be socialized across the system as a reduction in rates for transmission customers. And then on the flip side of that, potential for reduced revenues. For an entity like Bonneville, which earns significant transmission revenue from wheeling power to out-of-state entities, a reduction in those revenues could have an indirect adverse impact, i.e. increased transmission costs on its retail customers in state. And some concern has been identified about how a reduction in transmission revenues for transmission providers in Oregon could adversely impact investments to maintain those systems and thus threaten the long-term health of the regional transmission system. And cost shifts. Transmission benefits must be weighed against the recovery of costs for existing transmission assets and existing transmission contracts. There are concerns about potentially unfair and unjust cost shifts among transmission customers. And now solutions. Several potential solutions were identified from other regions. License plate rate prevents cost shifting to customers that were not part of the planning and approval process for an existing transmission asset. An RTO could utilize such a rate until those assets are fully paid, or as a transitional solution to phase in a reallocation of costs. Zonal or distance sensitive transmission charges or alternate RTO footprints could help mitigate impacts, but may reintroduce pancake rates. Congestion revenue rates, another alternative solution that could be the development of these kind of rights that provide revenues to holders to offset otherwise increased costs. And then as general feedback, multiple commenters identified value regardless of the particular solution in some sort of a transitional or phased in approach. So that was a lot of stuff there. But I think on this one, perhaps more than any of the other questions we've talked about so far, there's certainly some, I think, different perspectives here. So I will open up the floor for feedback and comments on these issues related to transmission rates, revenues, and potential solutions to deal with some of these disparate impacts. And again, sort of some prompting questions here. You know, are the things you agree with, disagree with, something that's missing, something you emphasize more or less than something else?
Hey, Adam, could you go back a couple of slides to the rates, the first one?
Sure.
There are, no, yeah, rates, not revenues. There, okay.
Sorry, I'll go to the end here.
That there's a relevant question here that I kind of like to get out on the table that's for our region, and that's this first one. End users in the Pacific Northwest generally have significantly lower costs for transmission service compared to other areas of WECC, and a uniform transmission rate could result in significant rate increases. So the example that comes to mind when I see this is the preference customers of BPA and their ultimate ratepayers. So one of the things that we included, I think, in our solutions, and I'm not the expert on this, but I know there are people on this call that could answer it, is I do believe when WAPA joined SPP, or that portion of WAPA joined SPP, there was a carve out or something for existing preference customers to not result in a significant rate increase for those. Is anyone able to talk about that and maybe how that might be a mitigating piece to use here in the Northwest on BPA's preference customers?
So this is Fred. Maybe I don't recall all the details, but yes, there was a kind of a special arrangement, but yet really to me not so special. And the arrangement basically was to provide that kind of zonal approach to the pricing. And yet I think of it as being part of a broader group of initiatives or approaches that have been done by the different RTO, ISO markets around the country to accommodate this issue. In that case, it was about how Federal Hydro, power marketing agency operations would be affected by being in the expanded market, and also about cost recovery. But lots of other examples exist, and I think, Adam, you've mentioned some of this. Some of the commenters have also mentioned, the possibility of kind of a zonal approach based on geography, or something that separates out existing transmission versus new projects, that separates new projects by voltage level and, roughly speaking, by the area that they primarily serve. There's a lot of those things if you look around the country, including in the California ISO, which basically grandfathered existing transmission contracts, and I think those have just expired or fairly recently. This will be a long-term process, and it will involve a lot of negotiation and adjustment to deal with the fairness issue, the kind of the embedded system cost issue, the forward-looking value issue, and I always go back to what my friend Ron Lair says. Some of you know Ron. He was quite a while ago. He was a Colorado commissioner and actually chair of the Colorado PUC, and has been very involved in Western policy since. And what he says is, don't let the transmission tail wag the overall power grid dog. But what he means by that is not to ignore or to underappreciate the issue of transmission cost and value, but rather to keep an eye on the bigger picture. In some ways, if our transmission costs go up in order to carry a lot more power in the ways that we need it and provide more market value, that may not be such a bad thing, but that's an investment choice that we should be making. It's not just that we should seek lower cost, period. We should be looking at, what's the value for what we're getting, the delivery value. And so that's the way I kind of look at this. So, call me optimistic on this one or whatever you want. Optimistic in the sense that I think that there will be compatible agreements that can come out of this, solutions, but also realistic in that it's going to take a long time to work it out.
Thanks, Nicole, for the question, and Fred for the response there. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add on that. I know this is transitional transmission agreements is a potential important topic for the Northwest, certainly, and lots to learn, I suspect, from other regions. So any of you who have thoughts or comments, input from how they've done this in other regions might be worth discussing those here. So.
And this is Fred. Let me add, if I could, I'm going to, if this is appropriate, I want to put a link for one of the recommendations I gave to Adam on literature review here. A book by Steve Esser, an economist and a kind of power historian who's in Texas, but he worked for PJM and for other consultancies and has been a law professor and so on. A really interesting book that had a lot in it about transmission, cost allocation, and all the issues that I think are very valuable. The book came out in 2015, so it's a little dated, but still very valuable. So if it's okay, I'll put that in the link.
Sure.
Adam, this is Spencer. I'll pipe in on this question and echo Fred's recommendation of that book. I think it's the single best overview of RTO formation that's been done as a policy history. This set of transmission issues that are raised in the slides here on question 5, I think are so squarely in the bucket of design details that really matter. I think it needs to be highlighted for legislators as a make or break question, depending on what kind of market design we have. It may be hard to be as satisfactory in pointing towards good solutions for this compared to some other design issues, although I think the ones that you highlighted here are really important to include. But I would also add that figuring out tricky questions about cost allocation, depending on the nature of your incumbent transmission providers, and Bonneville is obviously the most important one for our region, and is unique in many ways. But that discussion among potential participants and members in the RTO has happened a bunch of times. It had to happen in each of the multi-state RTOs nationally. So I think we should keep that in mind, that there are solutions that have been worked out elsewhere that we can draw on here, as tough as the cost allocation question is for the effects on transmission rates.
No, I appreciate that feedback, and yeah, being able to crystallize sort of the winners and losers potentially, and then how other regions have solved some of these issues and point to there are paths forward, but it's a matter of the details of how we design it. Any other feedback, questions, input on these big issues here? I'll give you another chance as I click back through my slides to get to the end here. So hearing no additional feedback on this one, if there's nothing else, I propose we move on to public comment. So I'll give another second here if anyone else wants to pipe up on transmission rates.
Hey,
go ahead.
You asked a question when we were talking. You've asked it like a couple times so far, and I don't know if we want to try and answer it, but it seemed like it was an important question, and that was like, what are the problems that we're trying to solve?
Sure.
Do you feel like you have
No,
that
I don't-
information from the respondents, or do we need to address that?
You know, it's something I was thinking we could try to address in the second workshop. We have a little bit of time here. If people have, if they want to talk about it with no prompting, I'd be happy to. Yeah, let's throw that question out. It sounds like, why don't you start us off, Nicole, if you have some thoughts? And
Well, I was actually thinking maybe it's something to prompt for the next conversation, because I think we could just go through a list and list off some of the issues, but maybe people want to have a chance for a little bit of thought around that, because it sounds like at least maybe one or two of the members on the Stakeholder Advisory Committee aren't sure about the problems that we're trying to solve. And I'm wondering if some of that came up in this conversation today. I don't know.
yeah, that's so. Yeah, that was my inclination, was to just for everyone to know. You know, I want to get some feedback from the advisory committee on if this is the best way to structure our next meeting, if there's some things we could do differently, and what, you know, are there other questions like that we should get out there? If that works for everyone, I was thinking we'd frame that question for the next meeting.
Hey, Adam, I liked what Nicole just suggested. I also think that we spent a lot of time looking at the financial piece today and really didn't spend a whole lot of time looking at either the sort of reliability or the environmental or the equity pieces. And I think maybe we should spend some time on that part.
Yeah, and this was mostly just driven by the way I had the questions organized. And so there was more of that on the remaining questions, certainly, but that is good feedback. Any other thoughts or comments? They can be about this topic or generally about how we're proceeding here and other potential items for our next meeting in a couple of weeks. Otherwise,
Adam, just on the transmission rates, you know, I think Spencer said it well. Relative, you know, I think and I think you said this as well, that you got a pretty wide range of response to this particular question. In many ways, probably because you have a lot of different positions within the incumbency, and I just think that's probably goes along with some of the recommendations that Spencer just, as far as the sort of the root cause of why you're getting such a wide response in this particular type of area.
I agree. Okay, so just as a heads up, if we have anyone, I will ask Linda, who works with Odo, if I think we're going to try to do this. We're going to try to do this through raising hands from members of the public. If anyone wants to be unmuted, I think we can do that now and get public comment. Is that right, Ruchi? I saw you pop up there.
Yeah, I just put something in the chat to that effect as well. So you're welcome to put questions in the chat and we can read them, or we can watch for your raised hand, and Linda can unmute and you can come on camera and provide public comment, and give people a few minutes too if they're kind of figuring that out.
Adam, I currently don't have anyone.
Okay. Well, we can hang out here for a minute and see if
Adam, I have a procedural question for you. Sure. We sort of took this first blush at this survey without a lot of context to it. As we circle back through the process, will there be an opportunity to provide some edits either in the final report or as we go through the process?
Sure. I mean, there is something that, you know, I thought maybe it'd be interesting to see if people's responses change if I ask the same questions again at the end. So if there's interest, I could certainly do that. It's also, you know, the survey itself doesn't necessarily need to be in the report to the legislature. It was more just interactive tool to solicit some feedback and see what comes up. I'm much more interested in the conversation and the substantive discussion of the issues.
Yeah, I agree. That so many of those questions interrelate that how you framed up a particular part was related to another part. So I was just wondering about the procedure for that, but thank you. I think that explained it.
Great.
Adam, we do have one question in the chat
Great.
from Michael Jung from PNGC. He was thanking everyone for a great discussion today, and he was hoping that it might be possible to add a question about the time urgency for getting an RTO up and running. Also, Michael, you're welcome to, we're happy to take you off mute if you want to ask your question directly as well or have follow-up.
Yeah, and I can, I don't know if he's been unmuted, but I can add there that that's certainly something I was going to follow up with our advisory committee here before the second meeting to think about other questions we might want to put on the table. Like I said, I want to make sure we're putting the right issues on the table so we can get perspectives, the breadth of perspectives that are out there on the relevant issues for the legislature. So,
hi, this is Michael. Can you hear me?
Oh yes, there you go.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity to put a question in. First, thanks everyone. This has been a fantastic discussion, a lot of work on everyone's part, and a lot of thinking that's gone into this already. My question is about time urgency. As I see it, and my perspective is relatively limited as I'm new to the organization, but it seems to me that there are kind of two factors creating some time urgency for getting an RTO up and running. One is that there are a number of efforts to set up parts of what would eventually constitute an RTO, and they're not necessarily being done in a way that are designed or intended to result in an RTO, and so you end up risking having some of the benefits of an RTO being taken off of the table by some one-off efforts to establish parts of an RTO. And second is there's an expiration of the post 2028 BPA contracts where folks out there are being put in a situation of trying to figure out what are we going to do, especially if the resources of the BPA end up not being able to satisfy the needs of the preference customers in the region and beyond. So kind of two burning platforms. I'd love to hear some perspectives if I'm right, wrong, or if there's another aspect of this that I'm missing.
Thanks for the question. Any responses there, thoughts, feedback to Michael's question?
I would say, Adam, to Michael's question, that the 2028 deadline is really not 2028. It's probably 2025. So that creates even more of a sense of urgency. I also know that there's a number of states throughout the WEC that are mandating RTO formation for utilities in their particular states, and I believe some of those deadlines are around 2030. So there's a couple of different deadlines more urgent than others, and so yeah, I think there's urgency to this. Based on both of those things and the fact that there's really, there's some groundwork and relationships being done, but an RTO is far from being actually pursued with that kind of urgency, I don't think.
And Frank, maybe for the benefit of those on the committee who might not be familiar, can you explain briefly the 2028 date that you threw out there and the significance?
Well, the significance is that all of Bonneville's customers all have the same expiration date on their contracts. And so there will be opportunities, and we haven't seen the full sort of complement of what's going to be offered beyond 2028 from Bonneville. And depending a lot on your situation, you need to be able to explore options going into a contract. Otherwise, there is no decision. You've made a decision by not making a decision and exploring options. It's my understanding that in the 2025 timeframe is when Bonneville will present products and contract options to its preference customers. So between now and 2025, there has to be some understanding of the impacts on transmission, on contracts for power, and et cetera. So that's the urgency for it.
So don't want to speak on behalf of Bonneville, but I do want to just clarify that the 2028 is commercial contracts. Bonneville's obligation is a piece of federal legislation that does not expire in 2028. So I don't think Bonneville customers have to worry about not being served or provided power after 2028. They have to make some evaluations of the cost they will have for procuring power. So just for point of clarification there.
Thanks, Ben. Do we have any other feedback to Michael's question? It's also something we could table and discuss at the next meeting if people want to think about it.
Adam, this is Ravi from Bonneville. I think Ben answered the question on the 2028 power, so I won't get into that. But I just want to raise a question for not just for the committee, but also for everyone else, all the public that are present here. We talk, the bill talks about whether Oregon should form an RTO. And my advice for this committee to look at it is, can Oregon really form an RTO by itself? You remember, power flows not with the state boundaries. Generators outside the state serve Oregon. Oregon generation serves outside Oregon footprint. Transmissions are all interconnected. They're not intertwined within the state. And so the limit is not confined. So whereas I appreciate the comment from Michael from PNGC about the urgency, I think this committee should also consider what is a more realistic RTO footprint look like that the Oregon utilities might want to consider joining. And the second question would be, should an incremental approach be used? I know the past efforts, I was part of some of them during my early years at Bonneville. One of the things that really stood out for me was the trust, building of trust across the different stakeholders and memberships of the RTO efforts. So I think a trust and an incremental approach probably leads to a better positioning for the folks to consider what an overall, eventually an RTO could look like. But trying to go at a very accelerated pace, realizing that there's a lot of uncertainties and frustration perhaps on the renewable community, that they're having challenges with access to transmission or being able to interconnect and be able to help states meet their objectives, but diving right into an RTO of a size of an Oregon by itself is probably, we're talking about not so much of a realistic goal. Again, this is my viewpoint, not Bonneville's, but this is Ravi speaking. And from my experience that I have been part of the various efforts in the past. I just wanted to kind of throw that out. I'll let others reflect and other people comment on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, for that feedback. And two things I wanted to comment on there. One, I think the footprint and kind of scope and scale of an RTO is a very good point. And I think there's questions that we'll be getting to at the next meeting that specifically address that issue. And the other is now slipping my mind. What I had on top of this tip of my tongue. I think it circles back on this question of what problem are we trying to solve, right? So I think that was you hit on some of that there. I think so. I think that's just kind of reinforcing. I think that's something I want to frame up for the next conversation, and so give some thinking to that, because I think that's something that we want to squarely address.
Hey, Adam, just to clarify though, I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind that this bill doesn't ask Oregon to answer the question of whether or not Oregon's utilities should join an RTO. So this process is not going to result in a decision, yes or no, whether Oregon utilities should join an RTO. So I just want to clarify.
And Adam, I never took the question that Oregon was specifically forming an RTO. It was to look at the benefits or costs or debt, the pros and cons of Oregon utilities to Oregon, that is, of joining an RTO or forming an RTO. It was not in Oregon specifically. It was an RTO in a more general sense, which is why the footprint matters too.
Yeah.
But did not specifically say, joining an Oregon RTO.
That's right. I agree with both of those interpretations. That's how I read it as well.
Right, and I agree, that yes, the question still about whether Oregon should join Oregon utility should join an RTO. Again, the question one should consider is about the approach. There's a lot of studies out there that talk about forming a West-wide RTO. No one has really gone and specifically talked about in this group today. Maybe we'll talk in the second meeting is about whether there should be more of a geographical location RTO that is comprised of maybe the Northwest entities or maybe the Northwest Power Pool entities, but not a Western interconnection. So I think we need to think about in a more staged and an incremental approach. If you think that way, the chances of success perhaps is higher, but if you go all in, then there are going to be the questions that we talked about. There'll be a lot of winners and losers. From a Bonneville standpoint, there's a lot of statutory limitations. And remember, we are running the main grid in the Northwest, about 1,500 circuit miles of high voltage transmission. So we have to balance. It's a balancing act. So if my comment was more about, whether the objective was for Oregon to form an RTO itself, maybe I'll reshape that comment and say, even if Oregon utilities, whether they should consider joining an RTO, the question still should be about the location, the locational size of the footprint, and using an incremental approach. There's a lot of efforts in play, something for you guys to consider. Again, this is me talking. I look at from a high level, and Sarah may agree with me on this. She and I have talked about it, but it's like a three-legged stool. You have a regional planning portion, you have a resource adequacy portion, and then you have organized markets. I think we already have an RPO in the region, Northern Grid. We already have efforts going on the west side, resource adequacy efforts going through Power Pool. And then there is the EIM, which is already in motion. A lot of entities have already joined, and Bonneville is already, in the midst of making a decision to join in 2022, question mark. So the thing is that leaves you with other parts of the organized market. So I think that incremental approach makes you learn from your mistakes and refine it before you go all in. So all I'm advising is that as you guys are providing inputs to the legislators, think about, all in versus an incremental approach. Look at the pros and cons of it and see if there's benefits in doing one versus the other. The ultimate result may still be an RTO, but the question is, how do you approach that? What pathways you take to get there? Just something to think about.
So this is Fred, just to respond to the basic question, and sorry if there's any background noise, on the, kind of the time value. Sorry, hold on. If I had my way, I'd ban two-cycle or two-stroke engines.
No,
right
we can't.
now.
You have good noise cancellation, Fred. I didn't hear that
Okay.
at all.
Well,
So.
you're fortunate you didn't hear that. So the thing I would focus on here is, yes, we could continue to go forward as we are with, 38 balancing areas or whatever the number is. Nobody counts them the same in the West, including a whole bunch of them in the Northwest, with the operational constrictions that provides, but also gives those balancing areas real control. And a full market would require them to give that up and, have another locus of control. They would still have responsibility in a lot of ways for local systems. But I think that, so we could keep doing it the way we're doing it, but we do have some things that are changing. I think the overall change, the biggest change is that we want, many of us want a more rapid decarbonization of the system. But why? First, to reduce emissions. Secondly, and I think this is very important, that both load and resources are in the West have great diversity. Oregon's just one state with one corner of that. We are not achieving the potential benefits of accessing that full range of diversity and the rapidly expanding list of resources that are out there on the supply, demand, and storage side that are more diverse at scale and location and type and performance is very complicated to manage, but also offers very great value. And to me, that's the advantage of moving toward a full market. That the full market would be able to take the greatest advantage of that resource diversity to decarbonize the system and to make it more reliable, both.
Adam, this is Spencer. If I could just pipe in, I think if you pulled the advisory committee here, you might find a diversity of views on what incrementalism means, what is satisfactory incrementalism versus a re-entrenchment of the status quo. And picking that apart could be useful for the legislators. There is a lot happening right now on its own in the absence of a firm direction in the state towards an RTO. But to Ravi's points about some of the other institutions in the region, members of my organization probably wouldn't agree that on the planning front, for example, we have a strong regional planning platform that goes beyond the plans of the incumbents to do what they're going to already do. So I would just suggest if you want to raise this kind of question in maybe the next forum of the group here, you might have a diversity of views on what incrementalism is satisfactory and what might not be for the different interests that we're speaking for.
Yeah, I like that idea. I'm thinking about potentially maybe I should ask you all to send me some questions that we could have to guide discussion next time. In addition to going through, maybe we could do a quicker review of questions 6 through 11. And yeah, I'm open to having, I said, I want to make sure we get the issues out, the right issues. So I'm happy to have more of this sort of roundtable discussion, however it takes shape. So I will take that question under advisement, as well as the sort of the one we talked about a few times about what problem are we trying to solve. I think those are two good ones for discussion on October 6th. Nicole, were you gonna jump in there? I thought I saw you. No, that's the problem with you turn your camera on. I start thinking things.
I'm mostly just trying to protect from the things that are going on in the background here, the kids, the dogs, everything. So
yeah, so I have a stop sign outside my door for that reason. Do we have any more public comments that have come in?
I'm checking right now, Adam. I don't see any at this time.
I still see Michael's hand raised, but I just wanted to confirm to see if he had a follow-up or if that was the hand from before.
That's my old hand, sorry.
A little more familiar.
All right. Well, I thank you all for this rich conversation today, and for, again, all the work and effort you put into your comments. And a special thanks to Representative Marsh, who I've lost track of on my screen here. Oh, there she is. Special thanks to Representative Marsh for the dedication here. I know it's been a busy day for her, and for Commissioner Tawney and the PUC and all their work consulting with us on this effort. So I will be following up with members of the advisory committee here in the next couple of days with some thoughts about structure for our second workshop. But I think this was productive today, and there was some really good conversation, and we gathered a lot of notes and information. So it's helping us do exactly what we were trying to do here and better understand these perspectives. So with that said, anything else before we adjourn for the day and pick this back up in a couple weeks?
Adam, I also wanted to confirm, I think you mentioned that the slide deck would be available on the website for reference. Is that still happening tomorrow, perhaps?
Yes, it is. Look for that. Yeah, I would say tomorrow for sure. It's at the ODO RTO website that I think you all have seen many times, probably. At the bottom, at the meeting section, we'll have these slides uploaded there for sure. And presumably a link at some point to the recording of this meeting if you're can't wait to rewatch it. All right. Well, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your week. And I'll see you on October 6th.
Thanks,
Thank
Adam.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.